It's just easier because otherwise the audience is going to miss like some of the best parts often happen before we hit record or after. And best parts doesn't mean that, the recorded part sucks, but it's more like I don't want to do these sterile interviews. And like I said, I switched from just talking about martial arts self-defense to trying to broaden out to life and to, my reason for doing that was mainly because when you start training when you're young, it's about you learn martial arts. Depending on where you live, that might be just as a hobby, as a sport, or like I need to learn to defend myself because I'm in this rough area and it needs to be very practical. And you do that for X number of years, and then eventually you get to the point like, okay, so you have your ideas that this is what self-defense is like and so on, or combat sports, or like in our case, both. And then after a while, you start looking more and more and more at, okay, what is causing all this? Why are you ending up in this fight with this guy over, somebody spilling a drop of beer on his jacket when you bump into him? And you get into the psychology and so on. You get into all the different kinds of violence that exist and the reasons why. And what I found myself these last few years going more and more into a broader scope, where it's more about, okay, why does violence in society as a whole happen? And then you eventually get to geopolitics. And for me, it's all related. And I mean, and like I said, we don't really have to go deeply into this, but what I've seen now, I mean, what's happening right now, we had the war in Ukraine, and then we have now what's going on in the Middle East, is that people are going insane, like truly losing their minds.
Say one point, and I love what you said, but I'll talk to an experiment that was conducted on addiction in America and how faulty it was. So they put some rats in a cage, and they put like opium or something, I forget what it was, heroin or whatever, in a drip. And the rats basically all got addicted to opium and whatever, right? So they're saying, oh, they drew conclusions of like willpower, this and that. But then what they realized, right? The rats are in this tiny cage with nothing to do and all on top of each other, and they're in a horrific circumstance. So human beings, and we don't like, especially in America, we don't like to admit this, but we are very strongly products of our environment. Right? We Americans are like cowboy and free wilderness, but we are absolutely products of our environment. And what they noticed was that, well, if you give these rats in this thing, you give them a wheel to climb and things to do and good space and a clean environment where they can play, relax, and de-stress and socialize and have a quality of life, they didn't want the drugs. And America has a tremendous addiction problem. We're addicted to so many different things. But one of the reasons was because we've constructed a society in which we are not self-actualizing in the Maslowian sense, right? Yeah. So we feel lost, we feel alienated, we feel so these things. And so because we're a product of this, very often violence erupts, right? And of course we have people live in economically very, very difficult circumstances, but a lot of times it doesn't explain the typical Los Angeles road rage guy. So you're a professional in your car, you're educated, whatever, and you're going off to your white collar job, and someone curses you out or cuts you off on the freeway, and you react like a crazy person, and you pull out a gun and shoot them, which is like, sounds weird for the people who are not American, but in California, this is like a thing, right? How do you get a rational, well-educated person from a good neighborhood, didn't grow up psycho, turn into an irrational, crazy person for these minutes? Because of the stresses of that moment, highway commuting, of the general, larger environment is so much. And you have to divorce. So I say, when I talk about self-defense, I talk about in the larger context. So first, I talk about an agency. So for example, we look at it, the big Samoan guy, 350-pound Samoan guy attacks you in that alley. Yes, of course, that's self-defense, but that is the least common form of self-defense. Let's take this. You're married to someone who you find abusive, distasteful, but because of economic circumstances, you absolutely can't leave them because the society has said that you as a person won't have custody of your children, won't have a life. You're absolutely stuck. Your agency is gone, or you're in a workplace and you're being sexually harassed, and you have to stay because you need this job to live. Or again, this is the idea of self-defense as agency. But the other thing is self-defense as filters. So our system, if I want to sell you something, I have to, the best way to sell you is to make you feel inadequate. So, Wim, your hair is wonderful, but maybe you should think about dyeing it purple because all the cool kids dye it purple, and so you need this purple dye because if you don't dye it purple, you're not a cool kid. And obviously as adults, we're not as susceptible to that. But as we see with the issue with Meta and their marketing towards younger individuals, they're very susceptible to this kind of like, you're inadequate. You have to be thinner, or you have to be stronger, or you have to look like, Arnold Schwarzenegger, or this or that. And so if you must filter out that noise that is designed to make you feel less than, to consume, because you will not consume if you feel self-actualized and happy. You will not be a voracious economic animal because you're like, hey, I'm content. Content does not give me your money. So I have to make you unhappy. And it is an incredibly important part of self-defense to filter out this bullshit that will make you feel less. And there's a lot of really interesting elements. Like, so for example, comes very deeply to our socialized program. If you say to a woman, sit in a feminine manner, what they will do is they will cross their legs, one over the other, and put their hands up. That is the most ineffective, meek position you could ever have for self-defense. So we've socialized women to be proper in meekness so that they are easily controlled and abused, right? This proper carriage and form is something that's hundreds of years old in the Western world and in the Asian world too. What do they do in the Asian world? They had kimonos, or Japanese, that were extraordinarily tight. I don't know, you ever see Japanese women walk in kimonos? They have to go like this. So you can't run away. There's a huge amount of society that is designed for the oppression or domination of others to my gain, not just gender relations, but everything. And we have to understand that the legacy ways of thinking are designed to take away your agency or to make you feel less. So if you're in a Japanese kimono, you can't run, you have no agency to escape. If you're a meek position, this is what ladylike is. Well, now that is the worst thing to ever do in grappling or to defend yourself. Now, of course, I could take advantage of you any way I want. Yeah. Right? So we have to counter program people to say, no, I won't accept this. Yeah. And that is extraordinarily difficult. So part of my training of self-defense is I try to broaden their minds and see self-defense as you are a product of your environment, and the environment deeply affects you. How can you defend yourself from this environment and not react in, the sort of animalistic, amygdala brain, fight, flight, fawn, play dead, this kind of thing? How can I react more rationally to protect myself, to protect my agency, and to protect my sense of self, my sense of adequacy and happiness? And how can I bring myself on this larger Maslowian continuum of self-actualization? And people don't realize the last element of Maslow was social cohesion and integration, and feeling part of a larger community who accepts you for who you are and values and what you give to. And self-defense is all wrapped up in this. You don't have those enough to eat, you will choose violence to eat. You don't have enough to place to live, very often you'll choose violence to find a place to live. If you don't have a sense of self, you will engage in toxic behaviors that reinforce your self-belief, right? If you don't have a community that rewards you and values you and you feel a part of, you'll become alienated, bitter, and violent. Like, the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, right? So you're absolutely right. It's connected. All violence is part of a larger connection because we as human beings are not lone wolves. No, we're not loners. We are pack and herd animals. And that's what we are. We're primates that are herd animals. And without the herd, we are not healthy.
Yeah. Well, I agree, and I want to push back a little bit on some things, and tell me what you think. There's a bunch of stuff that I'm going to try to have all the elements more or less coherently on the table. I totally agree that like nowadays, and especially with women, teaching them how to have boundaries, how to stand up for themselves, how to basically look at the conditioning that we have in society, how it pushes you in a certain direction and so on. I would also say that's the same for men. You're expected to be a certain way, but with the last, let's say, 20 years or something, this has radically changed, especially under the influence of postmodernism. The concept of like a safe space when we were young didn't exist. It's like non-existent. I'm not talking about good or bad, just saying like that wasn't a thing. So I think now the young people today, they live in a very, very different world than we did. I think we were like, we talked about being Gen X, that we're maybe the last generation that has a good idea of what it was before the internet and social media, while also being able to connect with that basically new technology that has taken over the world. Whereas like my kids, they're in their 20s now, they have no idea what it was like. They just don't know. They have like a phone, internet, and so on. So I think for a lot of young people now learning about violence, it's a radically different world, and they have more access to all the tools that we didn't have because it didn't exist, to become more self-aware about that and so on. Go ahead.
I agree with everything you say with caveats.
Yeah.
The world that you and I mostly live in, that is true, but that is not the world.
Oh,
what is
yeah,
like in Somalia, right?
Yeah.
What is like so in the Western hemisphere, we are very privileged in a lot of ways to have pacified society in certain areas, right? But also in New York, when I grew up, right? New York I grew up personally in a part of New York that was very, very safe. But when I traveled out of that, you could go to certain areas where you knew you were just toast. I mean, warriors come out to play. Like this was not a joke. Like this is the way it was. But I think you're exactly right that we have pacified society in some ways, but it's very class and sometimes racially divided. There are parts of America where it is like extraordinarily violent still, and there are parts of America where it is exactly what you described. That people are living in a very different, very sanitized, very safe world. And I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing, but I think it depends on where you are, in particularly class, and where you are geographically.
And I agree with that. And I didn't mean to imply that the way you said it's like pacified it. I don't think that's entirely it. What I meant is more that so it is true. There seems to be less violence than let's go through the millennia, and life was much more violent. So that's for sure. What I mean more is that again, we live in the youth now lives in a very different world than we used to live. Only if you go back 15 years, it was already radically different as opposed to now. And that just is what it is. The world is always changing. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I completely agree with you. So I had this discussion actually with some people recently that the younger post-millennial generation Z, they are cybernetic.
Yeah.
So what does this mean? It means you as a organism out individually, whether it's socialization, professional life, procreation, you cannot do anything in your professional life without Excel spreadsheet and a computer.
Yeah.
You cannot socialize these without Instagram, whatever, TikTok, whatever, Facebook, or a phone. Take a phone away from a teenager, right? You cannot work, go to school, or socialize, or even we consume media. We consume our entertainment. Everything we do as an organism is now linked to some sort of piece of technology, which means, by definition, the modern milieu is a cybernetic milieu. We do not interact in any way, shape, or form in all the human facets, work, play, everything, without some sort of technological tool. So it is an incredibly different life. I completely agree with you. I agree with everything you're saying, which means that, like the kids today, they don't experience the same level of school bullying and fists in the face like I do, but they experience a lot of online harassment, this and that, more things that are very, very different. And it's a completely different world. And it's very different. I completely agree. Now, how different? I'm not an expert on this subject, but the data shows that young people today are much more at risk for suicidal ideation, for depression, for self-medication, or medication by a physician. So in terms of developing many types of psychosocial behaviors that are not quote unquote health in terms of, what we would say is normative human baseline happiness. So there's something going on. Am I an expert in this? Absolutely not. But this is a very different world. And, the schoolyard or the street bullying, the street put your fists up, yeah, of course it still exists somewhere. But for those first world, more connected, affluent, cybernetic generation, it's very different. I won't pretend to be an expert on this, but I just want to say I completely agree with everything you said. It is very different.
It's different. And the one thing that I wanted to push back on a little bit, what you said, was more closely related to when you talk about, so historically speaking, we're still carrying on this basically legacy code of how societies used to be several centuries ago, that a woman had to dress like this and do that and so on. We're talking in a way about etiquette, how and proper behavior and whatever you want to call it. Young women were used to be sent to finishing school where they learn how to behave in polite society and all this kind of stuff. The guys had something similar. My point is that nowadays you often see a lot of critique, and along the line, I don't know if that's what you meant, so correct me if I'm wrong, but along the lines of what you said is that we're dragging this legacy code with us and we're still following that, and you kind of need to liberate yourself from that. I don't necessarily disagree, but I also want to point out that there are reasons why, for instance, etiquette is still important. It doesn't have to be the etiquette from 200 years ago, but there still needs to be this kind of modus operandi that we all more or less agree on, so that we don't end up fighting the whole time. And I think that's
Absolutely. Completely agree. I would say first, are these attitudes changing? Absolutely. Like, nobody says women can't wear skirts or something, right? For 100%, right? But there's still like the thing that, you're not feminine enough unless you're 100 pounds or whatever, right? But you're exactly right. It is definitely changing, and it is actually more across the board. Ideas of how you should look. It's non-gendered. A guy should be this or a girl should be this. It's always in flux. But I would also say you're absolutely right, that it depends on where you're growing up. Like, what I experienced as a New Yorker is not what someone, and you mentioned the Muslim world, like Iran, the gender relations, the interpersonal relations are completely different. Or in, a part of Latin America or in Thailand or whatever. This is all very, very geographically, class and culturally based, and class-based again. So 100%, I completely agree with everything you're saying. And I don't think we take everything in the legacy. However, I would also say you're 100% right. We need some sort of baseline etiquette. This is what I experienced, right? Japanese, they find America very confusing sometimes because they don't, there's so many different cultures, and they're like, what's the right way to act, right? And in Japan, it's like this, you're here, you do this. And the rules can sometimes seem oppressive, but everybody kind of knows the rules, which is one reason why there's no, you don't get the same level of street. I'll give you an example. New York City subway. You get on, and the guy's like, yo, shut your fucking radio up, motherfucker. And they and everybody's it. That would never happen in Tokyo. Just if you are on your cell phone in a crowded train in Tokyo, 400 people will suddenly look at you and like, how are you so rude, right? Because there's an understanding of thinking about others. In Japanese, it's called moyai, which means consideration. If we don't have a basic baseline of, hey, this is considered behavior, then we're in chaos. So we have to agree on certain social mores. Now, can this change as time goes by? Yes. For example, the social moray of my generation working just 20 years ago in the workplace was I was a translator. I put on a suit and tie to go to work. That's not the case anymore. Like guys, like I don't wear a tie to work anymore, or I go to work 5 days a week. That was just understood. Now, like most places are, remote working for 2. These social mores are absolutely changed, but there has to be some sort of underlying, hey, how do we run this society? What are the baseline expectations of manners and consideration? Now, like I said, some of these legacy things are not good, but the idea of do unto others as you would have them to do to yourself, like golden rule stuff, that should be something that we all think about. I was just talking about this with someone just before this conversation. Exactly, it had to do with the subway issue. So, for example, the baseline consideration of others in New York City is generally low. One, because it's New York City and there's a lot of tension, but also American individualism says the individual is first, and you know what? Your needs, fuck you, right? And that is not a healthy way to run that site. And then also you take that on the extreme where it goes, you come from a more disenfranchised, economically distressed neighborhood, and you feel alienated because of your social class and sometimes your color or your relationship with police, law enforcement, or something like that, with the educational institutions as well, or whatever. So you feel alienated. You know what? I'm gonna double fuck you. I'm gonna walk into a subway, smoking weed, blasting rap, which is what my instructor student just experienced, blasting rap as I had right during rush hour, where the place is crowded, nobody can escape. That is one, like the most, I mean, it's against the law to smoke weed smoke on the train, but it's also like the most inconsiderate thing. This guy's not thinking of anybody else. So I agree that we absolutely need some baselines of like, hey, this is appropriate behavior. And one of the things is like that I grew up like, for example, my mom was like, when you finish eating, you put your fork and knife like this. You do this. And, as I'm getting older, I'm appreciating this a little bit more. As a kid, I was like, whatever. But it just helps when you're at a restaurant. The server knows, oh, you're done and your plate is this. And also, these are just baseline manners, consideration, and a way to live your life. I agree with you. Being said, with America, when we're a country coming from made up of all different people with different ways of looking at the world, we have to find some commonality of behavior. Otherwise, it is pure chaos, right? But I think, it comes down to, like I said, if I consider you as a worthy human being who I respect and have consideration, I will think, hey, what can I do not to make your life awful?
Yeah.
Okay, let's not do that, right? Simple. Like we were talking before the podcast about treating waiters and waitresses with disrespect, and that's a terrible thing. This person is doing a job. I respect your job, and I don't want to be a jerk to you because you're a fellow human being. In Japan, like we were talking before, the Japanese very often, this is when I lived there for many years, have a very strong division between Japanese and outside. There's Nihonjin and Gaikokujin is polite, or Gaijin, right? And there's that division is very strong. However, even if you are a Gaijin, they still, at least it was my experience, consider you a human being worthy of manners. So people consider Japanese two-faced like this. So they're like, I hate you, but you know what? I will be polite to you. Why? Because you're a human being and you deserve politeness. I work with someone who I knew for a fact absolutely despised me. No, not because I was a foreigner, just that person didn't like me. But they were never, ever, ever rude to me. Yeah. Never. They were professional and they absolutely despised me. They just did, right?
It happens.
Yeah, it happens, right? It happens. I'm not the most likable person.
I've got that kind of face.
No, you do not. You have an adorable face.
No. I'll take my glasses off, and this is my natural resting face. Yeah, I have resting grumpy face. Everybody thinks that when I'm just neutral, that I'm angry or that I'm grumpy. I'm like, no, I'm not. It's just that's my face. In my
Can
defense,
I
I've
say
been
something?
punched in the face a lot.
My wife calls it my German face because my dad is part German. She goes, "Why are you putting on your German face?" So I know the German people out there. My dad was German, and she's like, "Why do you have your German face?" Because I'm like,
Yeah, yeah. But I agree
"So
with
you
you.
and
And
me together, buddy."
my girlfriend lived in Japan. She lived in Tokyo for 3 years, and she said the same thing. Is that people are extraordinarily polite, and just the whole concept of the etiquette there is so complex that she said like even many of the Japanese don't really fully get it because it's so difficult, let alone for an outsider to understand, and that what it means to be Japanese is something that as a non-Japanese, what I've been told is almost impossible to understand. Yet, and we talked about this beforehand. I mean, despite being this incredibly um, focused society on etiquette, politeness, and so on, they did some of the most horrible things during the Second World War that we briefly discussed a little bit before we started recording, and that seems to be at polar opposites of just daily life in Japan. Now, there are reasons for that, and the nationalism of the Second World War, and many other factors that we won't go into. But and I want to hear your thoughts on this. My theory, and I forget where I read about this or heard about this, but is that Japan as a country is actually quite difficult to live on without modern technology because it is there's tsunamis. The word comes from there. There's regular earthquakes, minor ones, but really freaking horrible ones as well. Large parts of the country are difficult to farm. It's not really accessible. Traveling is not always as easy, and so on. So what you have when you look at that environment, and it's an island, it's isolated to begin with. So then trade becomes more difficult, and so on. For instance, what I've been told or what I read was that the one of the reasons why the Japanese swords developed the way they did, because the metal ore was not of high quality like they had in Europe and elsewhere. So they had to develop these methods of making that. So all that together combines that this incredibly focused society on like we have to have discipline. This needs to function because it's freaking hard to stay alive here and to have a flourishing society. So I think in such an environment, it's not a wonder that this immense etiquette develops because otherwise it won't work because everybody would be fighting and
I'll add
fuck up.
another one. Japanese had no protein on a land-based proteins except for some wild boar.
Yeah.
So it's another one. It's hard to even get proper nutrition without technological innovation. And I completely agree. I would say there's certain points we can disagree on, but the general thesis you're saying, it's a tough place to live. We have to find a way to get along is not necessarily incorrect. Particularly modern Japan, Tokyo, is a very, very, very dense place. The population density is very high. And have you ever been on a subway in rush hour in Shinjuku? I forgot what it's like 8 million people in that one station alone per day or something. I forgot what the numbers. Don't quote me, but it's really high. And you get on a subway, and there's guys that smush you into the train, and you're like, "Oh, I'm sorry," and it is. If you're not polite, you cannot function there because the population density is not. Some of those general points, we can talk in detail, but generally speaking, the idea is necessity is the mother of invention, 100%. And I would also say that if you look at the history, this going back to martial arts, of Japanese manners, it's sort of like there's a kind of like a balance, especially for people around First Amendment people. But it's kind of like think about gun control. So what happens is Japanese was not a unified nation for a long time. It went also experienced almost 300 years of on and off civil war. America experienced civil war for a few years. Japan experienced it for almost on and off for 300 years. That profoundly influenced their culture and had a very, 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 very violent warrior culture. And all this like Japanese Bushido and all that's a lot of bullshit. These guys were fucking murderers. They were murderers. That's what they were. They were feudal warlords who just wanted to kill the guy next door. And there's so many examples of horrific brutality on the level of Genghis Khan or something. So there's these great, I was telling a friend of mine, there's these great Buddhist temples in Tokyo. So one of and these are called the blood temples. And what happened was their samurai families were retreating in the face of an onslaught. And then so the samurais and their kids and their wives all got packed into one room. And then the invaders came in, and this is more than one place. They came in and they just killed them all and just chopped heads. And, you know, when people get their femoral artery or their carotid artery or their aorta cut, there's quite a bit of gushing blood. So all across the tatami, which are the floorboards of this traditional Japanese sitting rooms, all across the tatami, the wall, just gushing blood, and then people would fall, and you'd see silhouettes of corpses or people who've been murdered. And you see the one when I went there, you see this silhouette of a probably 2 or 3 month old baby who's basically been beheaded, and there's a gap between the head and the rest of the body, but the whole silhouette is there. And you're in the middle of what was an incredibly brutal assassination of every single member of that clan, extermination from the oldest to the youngest with absolutely no qualms. So you're talking about people that Bushido, innocent, forget that. These guys were killers. So what did Bushido develop when Japan had to pacify and develop codes? Hey, you've got guys running around who are just psychos. So how do we control this violence? Well, we put up strict codes of behavior and interaction. Like, do you notice Japanese drive on the quote unquote long side of the street? Do you know why this is? Or the British side, you know? So the Japanese have their swords on one side. So if you bumped into a Japanese samurai on the sword side, he'd just take that sword out and you disrespect him. He'd start cutting, especially if it's 2 samurais, because it's that, you know, like, who's the top dog kind of. So everybody decided that we're going to walk on this side so that we don't bump into each other's swords. And we walk on the British side. I'm in Belgium. Which side of the road do you drive?
We drive on the right side.
Yeah. So it's like America. So same thing, Japanese are on the British side because of the nature of where they wore their swords. So they would not, and this is matters. If you were walking on the wrong side of the street, you're basically looking for a fight. You're breaking the taboo of manners. And everybody knew this is terrible. No. You have to walk on this side of the street. And there's also strict rules of behavior of when you want to kill someone. So people would say, okay, just pull your sword out and kill. But then you had to go to like a kind of, not a tribunal, but like the daimyo, the head lord, would have this idea of investigation. So they had very strict codes of Bushido, which was basically the etiquette of how you control a population made up majority of psychopathic killers with arms everywhere. So it was sort of like a bit of gun control. And this only appeared after the partial or majority unification of Japan, after the Tokugawa shogunate took over and basically unified most of Japan, but most of Japan wasn't Okinawa. But basically they had most of Japan under control. And they're like, okay, now we got to take these guys and pacify them and make sure that we have some sort of, social stability. And the other reason was interesting how they would never pay samurai in money. Samurai never were paid in money; they were paid in rice, so that they would not make samurai fight along economic reigns. So there was behaviors that were controlled, but also your income, because people eat rice, so you can't hoard rice. Like you get paid in rice, but you could of course hoard income. And that was for all levels of social control. Wait, what side of the street you walk on, how you get paid, how you interact with people. And that became the Japanese etiquette. But it is not applied to foreigners. Well, at least it wasn't for a long time, And so the other is, hey, we can treat these people like dogs or animals, subhuman. I shouldn't say dogs pretty well, but we can treat these people like subhuman because they're not part of our larger system. The other thing is Japan does have a lot of geographic variation. So it is not one unified, you look at Japan and say Japanese are Japanese, but really what this is Kanto, larger Tokyo, which is Kanto area, Kanto culture. When you go to Nagoya, when you go to Osaka, when you go to Kyoto, when you go to Hiroshima or Kyushu, or even the Northern Islands, the cultures are very different. Particularly when you're dealing with the smaller tribes like the Ainu people, which is a completely different culture. They're these Japanese indigenous people who are almost wiped out. Or you look at the lower caste members, the Burakumin, which were they had the leather workers and things like that, the untouchables of Japan. These are very different cultures, but also there's just geographic variation. So Japan was never one unified culture, but the shogunate put on these rules. So this is the way we act all across Japan. And even to this day, like I said, there's these legacy elements of their culture, particularly super simple. Like I said, the side of the street they drive on. They drove on there because people used to have samurai swords. That's it, and it's very interesting,
And that makes
I generally agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, because I mean, if you're in a society where war is the standard, like you said, centuries of civil war, you need to have warriors. You need to have people who know what the hell they're doing when it comes to basically slaughtering older people, which take to be competent at, which does take a fair amount of training, and then with experience, and that experience needs to be passed on, and certain things have to be a given. It needs to be understood by everybody, like, okay, when this happened, we all grab our swords and we go at these guys. When this happens, we have to retreat, and so on. And if you grow up in such a society, it is taught to you from the get-go. Eventually, the whole of society is going to adapt to that. Now, when, like you said, there's a pacification process that happens, everybody who is in that process knows that this can still go the wrong way very fast. So we need to maintain this warrior class and this way of thinking. But like you said, we do need to control it. It needs to be under our control. So we add etiquette and so on. And then we get, I see the parallel to what the late Bob Orlando wrote in his book Martial Arts America, is that he talks about the cycle of evolution and devolution of martial arts and fighting arts. And I think it's an
excellent work.
Yeah, and for the audience, it's a good frame to use. I think it's like, nothing. You get in a fight and you try this and that. This works. This doesn't work. You get a few more fights, and you find a couple of tricks or moves, like a big haymaker when he's not looking and so on, that you develop. So you've got a bunch of stuff. Now, given enough time and training and experience, you'll figure out that if I kind of, organize this a little bit better and find a few variations, instead of just a haymaker, I'm going to turn it into an overhand, and that might end up leading me to a right straight and so on. You develop a fighting system, a bunch of techniques that are coherent, and you can teach them as a package, so people learn very quickly how to do what you know from experience, and you figure it out by yourself. And then we get to the next part in the cycle, and that's martial arts. We add a bunch of other stuff. And like a guy I knew, a special kind of guy, but he said that you find that in many warrior cultures, they develop religion, in perhaps as a way to come to terms with the fact that you're very likely to die because fighting is dangerous, but also to live with yourself afterwards. And that you develop this kind of way of thinking that there's something larger, and I fit into this larger whole. We get back to Maslow and so on. But also that gets added on top of the fighting system. It's not just about fighting anymore. We need to add more. We need to add etiquette. We add forms. We add rituals. We add a bunch of stuff that turns it into a martial art, which is not necessary to be good at the fighting system. We just add that stuff to it, and it develops mindset, it develops self-control, and all these other things. But then the devolution basically continues into a martial sport or a combat sport, where there's no swords, there's no kicking the groin, there's no poking in the eyes. We leave out a bunch of stuff.
No martial sport, nothing. It devolves into, for lack of a word, like Asian-inspired exercise.
Yeah. I do Tai Chi, so loads of people think Tai Chi is just like yoga. It's not. It's called Tai Chi Chuan. Chuan means fist in Chinese, so that's like the way of the fist of this or the fist of that. Means like the karate do or judo. The do is the way of, and the Chinese they call it fist, and it is used to explain that this is a martial art. This is for self-defense. 99% of people who do Tai Chi don't do it for that. And they look at me like, that's not Tai Chi that you're doing. I'm like, oh, okay, I guess you know. But the point I want to make is that those people who end up in that basically combat sport, and I think the lowest part is when you get to like point fighting, where you're not allowed to make contact. And I've done point fighting competitions, semi-contact, and there's a huge difference having done both that and full contact fighting and so on, that if you have to pull your techniques as fast as you are, it is not the same as when you actually get to land it. And if you think it's easy to get the overlaps to switch from one to the other, I wish you all the best. But then a lot of people who only know fighting sports, combat sports, and never went through the stage of the figuring it out, getting to the fighting system and then the martial arts. They only start at the point where everything is watered down. They then get into a fight and they're like, holy crap, my jump spinning back kick didn't work. I fell on my ass and the guy booted me in the head and they kicked my ribs in and I lost a bunch of teeth. Like, well, this doesn't work. And we get back to square one. What works, what doesn't work, and they have to figure it out. And that cycle repeats. And I think on a societal level, it is similar. Francis Fukuyama said after the Berlin Wall fell, famously, that this is the end of history.
Yes.
How wrong was he?
Well, also, in my defense, I've never been a fan of Francis Fukuyama, and in my original work, when he said it, I critiqued it. So hey,
you were on for something.
Yes. Jesus Christ.
But I mean, you and I were there. We remember the Berlin Wall falling, and everyone was like, "That's it. The Cold War is over. America won. Unipolar world, and so on, and no more wars. And this is going to be the century of blah blah blah." And I'm like, I recently wrote this on my social media. It's like, how wrong was he, and how totally did he misunderstand human nature and history? If there's anything we know, that war is a constant in human history. In my neck of the woods, it's been since the Second World War, so since 45, that there's been an actual war where I live, in let's call it my country now. But before that, there was never, ever a period that long of no war, going back millennia.
Yeah.
So, and all of a sudden,
and geographic, I'm a sort of deterministic thought. The geographic nature of the lowlands of Belgium, Holland, are so central in the northern invasion. The thing that they're always going to be someplace. I mean, where did the Allies try to make it through Belgium? In Market Garden, failed, but that's how they were trying to make it into Europe, in northern Germany, right? Geographically, it's interesting. If you look at the Ukrainian war right now, right? I said this on my podcast, which of course we're taking a break from, but you're seeing battles take place in the Ukrainian war that are almost in the exact same spots as World War II battles, that were also on the same spots as when the hordes of kind of Mongols and things came through, because there are only certain geographic ways to go. So these points of very strong strategic interest. And until there's a massive earthquake and the world patterns change and we go back from, to some sort of different geographic orientation, those points will always determine importance, right? It's like I said, we're products of our environment. So yes, but Belgium has been very lucky with the Pax. I don't want to say Pax Americana or whatever. That's kind of like
no, I agree.
But we've had a pacified Europe that has been organized under NATO. So the strategic line of offense was always more the Cold War line, rather than and that's shifted now past that. Now Finland and Ukraine eventually will join NATO. So the line of conflict is pushed further, at least. But we'll see. We'll see. But yeah, Fukuyama's
he was wrong. Yeah. And what we had since then was the rise of postmodernism, the rise of many philosophies and ideologies that can only function in a pacified society and in a pacified world. And now all of a sudden, and we see that, well, there's war in Ukraine, the Middle East is about to explode. We don't know how far that's going to go, but China is on the rise, and that's a whole big discussion in of itself. We've got terrorism. We just had last week. We had an ISIS terrorist shoot up a few people with a machine gun. That is a big failure of our government in and of itself. But I'm not going to go on a rant about that. But my point is that when you can only have certain ideologies that function because we have this modern Western society we live in that is mostly, on average, peaceful and not that violent. As soon as we get to the situation where that happens, a lot of the lessons from the past, like we had, like you had in Japan, like how do you be warlike, how do you defend when the other tribe attacks you, and so on. Those lessons go away. They go out of the consciousness, the public consciousness, and things that were there for a reason now slowly go away because people don't see the reason anymore, because it's been generations since that was necessary. And then we get back to what we started with this idea of social constructs, social contracts, and so on, that come from the past. Just because there is this hierarchy or a social contract that is ancient in its origins doesn't mean that by definition it is wrong. What I've seen the past 15, 20 years happen is that people pushed back very hard against that, and we need to get rid of all this, and it needs to be that. And I'm like, your ID has to be proven. You want this, you want to change radically how society works. That has yet to be proven. I think that's a big gamble, but more power to you. It's a good idea. Hold on. But on the other hand, what are the reasons why we used to have that? And that's just as a fence, right? Don't break down a fence until you know why it was put there. And I think this disconnect is now happening. And the best illustration, is the last part I'm going to say, is I just saw this video by a Gen Z guy on YouTube or on Twitter or whatever, and it's going viral because he's going on and on about, well, Gen Z doesn't give a fuck about all this war stuff. And so if there's a draft, we're just not going to go. Hell, we even decided that we're not going to pay back our student loans. So fuck the government, fuck this, we're out. And I'm like, young man, you will learn that the government has let you say all this kind of stuff. You have your freedom of speech, but you will learn something else that has been known for millennia, and it's dura lex sed lex. The law is harsh, but it is the law. So when the draft comes and you don't want to go, they're going to grab you and ship you off to boot camp, and then you're off into an airplane or on a ship, and you're going to end up in that war zone, whether you like it or not. That is the reality of life.
Of course, it's funny because they don't understand that because they live in this world of tolerance, that what it's like to live in a world of not tolerance. And
exactly,
yeah, for sure. But I want to say you agree with everything you said, and it's brilliant. We're talking about Francis Fukuyama. I want to bring it a little bit back to martial arts. You know what the Francis Fukuyama of martial arts was with the UFC, where now the be all and end all of all combat sports is the MMA. And I'm an MMA guy. I coach MMA. I love MMA. I think it's a very important tool. And let's look at the concept of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is hierarchical movement towards a larger positional goal, which is generally like take the guy's back, right? So you go side control, mount back. Now, why didn't this exist in Japanese Jiu-Jitsu? Because this concept of like going to the guy's back is so dominant. Once I get behind you, the ability to kill you is just really, really high. So majority of victories in the UFC are either I take your back and choke you, or I take your back somehow, I expose your back somehow, and punch the crap out of you. So the majority of TKO victories, which is the most common victory, is when you partially or completely exposed your back, right? Rear naked choke, TKOs from that position, or you expose your back and I anaconda you or Darcy or something like that, or sometimes either, right? So this concept is really, really important and does not exist in any way, shape, or form, this powerful understanding of pins in Japanese jiu-jitsu. And then the answer is like, well, Japanese jiu-jitsu sucks. No. What it is this was a different milieu. Yep. You're grappling in one, maybe armor, but two, with a weapon. Burton Richardson is a very famous JKD instructor and great guy. He talks about this all the time. The rule of taking it back is completely thrown out when a bladed weapon is in play.
Yeah.
Right? So Japanese jiu-jitsu was always about isolating, and very often, very little chokes. Why can't you choke that? If I'm wearing an old samurai helmet or a neck piece, I'm not getting choked very easily, right? If a blade is in play, I need to control the arm, which is why arts like Aikido or Japanese Jiu-Jitsu are so largely focused on arm works. The funny thing is, in our academy, I see MMA as a very important foundation, but we always do some bladed grappling, stuff rolls with weaponized rolls, something like that. So the minute that happens, the hierarchical position of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has to be put on hold in favor of weapon control. Now, once you've gotten the weapon out of position, right, or you control that arm, now you can go back to the standard operating procedures of modern MMA and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is dominate the back, right? And not to say that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is not useless, but everything is contextual. And just saying, hey, UFC, that's the question of self-defense, everything else sucks, is stupid, just like Fukuyama said, oh, end of history. No. Things that came before have value if you understand the context in which they were created. And the only reason this thing works here so well is because we've taken out certain highly violent variables. And when we put those violent variables back in, suddenly this stuff over here kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
Right.
But you need to have somebody who understands why that was there. And then we get back to the best of my knowledge, even in Japan, let alone in the West, there's nobody chopping people up with samurai swords anymore on a consistent basis. So a lot of the information gets lost unless it is really well preserved, and even then, it's really hard. But this is where what I see, which is a big challenge, is that I agree with you what you just said. It's like, okay, when there's a weapon involved, there's a knife involved, you have to go more along the traditional Japanese jiu-jitsu side. And if the weapon is not involved, you can do more, BJJ and so on. My point then becomes, you will not always know that the weapon is involved up front. The best example is, I think it was Guy Metzger, who, if I'm not mistaken, was a UFC champ or very close to it. And I have this somewhere on my blog. I'll see if I can find it and put a link in the show notes. I'll write a quick note to myself then.
He got to a fight in the parking lot and got his thumb cut up.
Almost, yeah. And it was a guy who has a big argument with his girl. I think he slapped his girl. Guy steps in. Guy tries to punch him or something. He knocks the guy down. Bit later, the guy comes back and swings at him, and I think he blocks it and then just hits the guy. And the guy had a knife. And the thing is that he said, "I didn't see knife." All right. So and I've talked with many instructors about this, and I think it's basically a dilemma, and it's a choice you have to make. So if you say, I train for sports, whether it's BJJ tournaments, whether it's MMA and so on, it's a very rough sport, a lot of contact. But there will never be a knife involved, unless maybe you go somewhere in Russia. But I'm sure there's some crazy Russian organization that does that kind of stuff. But overall, that's not an issue. Multiple opponents, never going to be an issue. So there's a lot of factors that we leave out to make it a sport. And like you just said, once that factor is there, you have to change your priorities and your techniques. When you train with self-defense in mind, if that is the goal or one of your goals, I think it makes more sense to assume there will be a weapon. I'm going to treat this incoming punch as if it has a weapon. If there's no weapon, I'm aces, that's really good. If there is a weapon, I incorporated that into my training from the get-go. Like you have with your samurai sword, is that, yes, he had a neck protector, he had a helmet, you can still get the knife in. You're going to have to lift the helmet. That needs to be somewhere in your training that you know that move is there for a specific reason, which makes zero sense in unarmed combat because there's no helmet, there's no neck protector. But if you're fighting other guys in armor, that is absolutely what you're going to have to learn to do. Same thing, if you And I've shown this just recently in my MMA class. I had the discussion with one of my students, and I said, okay, so how did I teach you to block, this big haymaker? And he blocks it. I'm like, fine. And we talked a little bit more. He didn't see what I was doing. I said, okay, do it again. And I hit the same punch, and I just snuck my training knife out, which is blunt. And I was like, okay, I just stabbed you in the arm. Your arm is now pinned against your upper body because I stabbed all the way through because you blocked it. You don't trade knife cuts and stabs with punches with the other guy. You punch, he stabs, you're not winning that one. It's not working. So the defense needs to be different. It cannot be the same one. So and merging these two environments is incredibly hard. And that's when I wrote Boxing for Self-Defense. It was what I tried to talk, and some people got very upset with me about that. It says, look, if you're used to boxing in the ring, and I love boxing, it's perhaps the first martial art that I ever truly knew about and loved. But if you're training as a guy who's going to go in the ring and fight rounds and this and that, what you use for self-defense needs to be adapted. And that is a difficult task to do because you drilled for millions of times how to throw that jab and how to do this and how to do that. And all of a sudden you have to switch mindsets like, no, I cannot do that now. But what do you think? You're that age, you fight the way you train. Well, if you don't train for that, how do you expect to be able to pull it off when your life's on the line all of a sudden? Okay, end of rant.
No, absolutely. And your points are phenomenal. And I agree with everything you said. And you actually came up with the largest dilemma that informs my modern training. How can I make my students into, for lack of a better word, Swiss Army? What's a Swiss Army knife? It's adaptable to different circumstances so that they have enough awareness to switch the patterns depending on what. I can give you a street fight where Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, straight up Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu would be the best thing. I can give you another street fight situation where Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu would be the worst thing to do. I can give you a street fight where boxing would be the best thing to do. And I can give you another street fight situation where it would be the worst. Yada, yada, yada. So everything is, hey, I've got these tools in my toolbox. I'm not going to use a saw on a screw. I'm not going to use a screwdriver on a piece of wood, right? I need to take the right tool in my toolbox and take that tool out, which starts with obviously awareness and observation of the circumstances. However, we, unlike the Japanese who created heiho, so people talk of Budo. Budo is a modern word that doesn't exist in ancient Japanese. Budo meaning martial arts, but that's not a modern word. That's a modern creation of Japanese language. The original words were something, 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 heiho, warrior, warfare way. And in this heiho, hei meaning soldier, ho meaning way, like do, but Japanese, different language, right?
Yeah.
Different word, right? And in this heiho, they would have how to fight unarmed, how to fight against an armed guy, how to do sword fight, how to fight on horseback, how to fight in the water in armor, meaning how to fight while you're swimming and trying not to drown, right? Because Japan has lots of rivers. So there's also this famous battle called Demeere, which happened like 80% in these riverbanks, right? And have to be drowned, right? Because they're wearing armor and and drowning because they're being weighed down, right? And what are all these situations? So the ancient Japanese idea was, let's create a Swiss Army knife, right? Which is really, really correct and important. Obviously, they're dealing with different situations. We don't need to learn how to defeat a guy on horseback. We don't. But the larger concept is the same. But the issue is you're not a professional soldier, meaning all you do all day is train. If you're coming in 3 days a week, what techniques can I give you that can be easily adapted to certain circumstances, right? Now, one, I always see MMA as the general foundation, me personally, because I think it draws from the larger adaptive groups of outside striking, inside stand-up grappling, grappling against an object, and then ground grappling, right? And these are all like where we can understand our body, how it moves in space, how to generate force, how to move these. I think this is a really good place to start, but it is a place to start, not to finish. It's developing, particularly it develops a lot of good physical fitness and things like that. And, honestly, if you're not in good shape, which is the problem with every combative guy, it's like these fat dudes with big machetes, like, dude, 2 seconds in, I don't care if you have a machete, you're going to be exhausted because all you did is, McDonald's hamburgers all day. And you're out of shape. Like, yeah, that machete or that Glock isn't going to save you if you're, 2 seconds in, you're just puking up. So I'll just shoot it. Well, you got to get that gun out.
Yeah.
And in a closed situation, maybe you don't, and you have to wrestle, right? So anyway, but MMA is the place to start. So my goal is to cut. I don't believe in styles. I believe in data analytics. What are the most efficient ways, based on not my experience, not your experience, like the way old style, but larger data analytics of what's working in elite contests of mixed martial art. And then also the students, other instructors and I got together, we have a database of 8,000 self-defense assaults. And we play out how these things happen. I know you collected a huge amount of video as well. So like video study and statistical analysis of how things work out. And you say, take what works in MMA at the highest level. And would this be adapted to those situations? Interesting thing is, who is the best fighter of this last generation? Well, there's no question, it's Khabib Nurmagomedov. Khabib's body control system and the way he dominates positions frees your hands up. So let's go talk about Japanese judo grappling or jiu-jitsu grappling on the ground, just on the ground, for example. And this is not to say that they're useless, but when you pass the guard, and for the people who don't do jiu-jitsu, your legs are in front of my legs. I have to get past your legs to get a pin position, right? So there's so many guard passes. You can go under the legs, you can hitch the legs on your shoulder, you can do a knee cut, which you put the knee in. Now, the interesting thing is a huge amount of this set of moves in the arts of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and judo, because Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu comes from judo, never appear in modern mixed martial arts, or very rarely. The number one way to pass the guard in mixed martial arts is I throw you with a double and I keep going, right? Which is never practiced ever in judo, because now judo double legs are legal, and very rarely practiced in in sport jiu-jitsu. Also, the number one pass in sport jiu-jitsu is a knee slide, which requires the number one practice and attempted in sport jiu-jitsu, not successful, but the number one attempted pass is generally we call the knee cut with knee slides, right? The number one attempted, right? Okay, in IBJJF gi, right? The last knee cut pass in high level mixed martial arts was almost over a decade. So why are we putting so much emphasis on the thing that doesn't happen in mixed martial art, but only happens as one dimension? The other thing is this: when you're doing a double underhooks pass, which is another one that doesn't happen as much, you're committing your hands and your legs, and you are basically very vulnerable if you're not really quick to take your head out, because the guy could just stick his fingers in your eye, or he'll have his hands free to draw a weapon. You look at the way Khabib passes, which is a combination of his father's teaching plus the teachings of Leonardo Vieira. So Leonardo Vieira, Leo Vieira, and taught Damian Maia, and Leo Vieira taught his brother, who taught Khabib. Damian Maia and Khabib are the top passers in the history of mixed martial art, and they do one thing: the Leo Vieira system. I mean, they do sometimes others, but generally speaking, they do one. The third best passer in mixed martial art is George St. Pierre, who does one pass. The fourth best passer in martial arts, in mixed martial art, as statistically go, is BJ Penn, who was also taught by Leo Vieira. Three of the top four passes were taught by the same guy. But Khabib did something interesting. He welded what his dad did. And because his goal was, my goal is not to pass. I don't give a crap about passing. I give a crap about damage, because passing doesn't matter. So most of his passes are what we call hands-free passing, where his hands are free to punch you. This is also very effective if I'm in a grappling engagement. If my hands are free, I can use them to stop a knife assault if it appears. So a lot of what I did in the last 7 years is remove all these techniques that I think could work. They could. They're not wrong, they're not bad, but they're low incidence in terms of MMA. They happen less. They're high requirement of discipline to practice. Like, you really need to work the knee slide pass a lot to make it work. So I'll give you an example. One of my teachers Lucas Lepre is, by statistics, the best knee slide dancer in the in gi jiu-jitsu, right? Amazing, amazing. But even still, he has to work very, very, very hard when he fights his level guys. One famous match was he's fighting Leonardo Vieira, and we can talk about his. I mean, Leonardo, not Vieira, the one who was killed in Brazil, got stabbed.
Oh, right. I know who you mean. I forget the name.
Anyway, that's another story about like understanding when weapons were involved, right? Although he wasn't killed in the incident, he let the guy go, said, hey, we're all cool, went back to his table, and then the guy came behind him and killed him, right? So, you know, the weapon didn't, or he shot him, something like that, right? The weapon didn't get involved until after he let him go. But that's another story of like how MMAs were martial arts as the start, but never the finish. But anyway, so he has this fight against, and the name escapes me, right? But it's back and forth, knee slide versus counter, and it goes on forever. And he struggles tremendously. Then you see another person trained by Leo Vera fighting the same guy, use the passing system, and he passes like that. And his hands are free. And imagine if we're MMA, he wouldn't even have to pass. He just close the legs and punch him. Or if a knife's involved, and I've trained this for the last 5 years. I don't know when the knife's coming out, but I'm going to dominate your body and legs as if it were there. So if you don't have your hands free, my hands are controlling your hands, or my hands are completely free, and my legs are the only thing controlling the legs, whether it's up against the cage, whether I'm trying to take down or on the ground. My hands are free and yours aren't. Then the danger of it becoming a weaponized encounter is much less. But I'm always paying attention to certain things. Now, you know, I created a guard system. I didn't create it, but I developed a guard system called the rack. People call it the rack guard, right? But there's a flaw in the rack system because there's one side where the hand is free. And I always tell people, watch that hand because it could reach back and stop. So we play with this all the time in the academy where I give a fake knife, I give this. So right now. Yeah. It's stuck in my, oh, here it is. I take this and I give this to one of my students and I say, pull it out when you least expect it. Yeah. And it's a very, very, very rude awakening. You're like, and it hurts, but it doesn't hurt, right? So we always start with mixed martial art as the foundation, and then we try to go further. But that being said, you have to understand that people do not have 24 hours in the day to spend doing martial arts. So you have to give them, cut the extraneous stuff and stick to things that are highly adaptable. And you talked about blocking. So I actually just gave a very similar lesson a couple of days ago with the knife when you block. And the way I block is we always, if we block, we step in and consistently elbow. And then we step out or we clinch and get out because the knife has to glide around here. And this elbow is now in your jaw. So I'm not just boxing block like this, because then this knife can also come over here. So I'm protecting the most important parts of my brain case, right? And the medulla oblongata and cerebellum back here, which are not protected. I'm also stepping in deep so your punch goes right. And worst case scenario, I'll get scraped on the back, but I'm not going to get killed. And immediately I'm either out or controlling your arm somehow. So you can't punch me, but you also can't stab me if the weapon was involved that I could see. So I was actually teaching the exact same thing. That being said, I have not perfected the system of how I can give small number of moves that are highly adaptable. Everywhere I'm still working on it, but it is basically the entire thing that motivates the way I think about martial arts is how in 2 hours of training 3 times a week can we give you the most effective and adaptable tools to survive violent encounters. And it's what motivates me every single day. And how can I update and remove the extraneous amounts? And what I'm doing today is really just pruning, right? I'm saying we don't need this, we don't need this, we don't need that. The entire Gracie armbar system that you saw back then, it's gone, right? I spin around doing armbar and the guy will pick me up and slam my head, possibly. That's not always a given. I've seen it work in street fights, or you're breaking my arm, but I reach over and grab a knife and stab you in the femoral artery and kill you.
Yeah.
Right. So, or with my free hand, like if it's loose, I reach over and grab your testicles. A person did a foot lock yesterday in my academy. It's for another gym. And I said, try it. I'm going to now grab your testicles and we'll see. You break my foot, but you'll go unconscious from me twisting your testicles. You'll go unconscious. My foot may be broken, maybe not. But your testicles are shredded and you're unconscious. And now I will murder you.
Yeah.
Right. So we always have to think about like larger violent encounters. And there's this set of possible moves. But these are most of the things over here are not so adaptive. I'm trying to bring it here to these sweet spot of highly effective, low risk moves. How do I define highly effective? Levered, has control, upper body control primarily. Levered and has what kind of called kazushi, which means body misalignment. So if I'm like this, it's going to be very hard for me to draw a weapon and stop. So everything we do has to have those three qualities and has to be thought of. First, does it work in a self-defense environment? Does it work well in a valued environment? Does it work well in an MMA? And then if it doesn't pass this muster, we have to kind of rethink it. And then we can go back down here and go individual sports. Does it work in sport boxing? Does it work in sport jiu-jitsu? Does it work? But that's not even something I'm thinking about. But, we can think about that if the person wants to compete in a sport of context. But first, we think about this. But we always have resistance training with sparring, which, we're not living in the combative wonderland where, yeah, I'll do this and I'll do that and I'll do this. And, oh, great. Now you guys can go back and get out of your fantasy land of imagination. You must be a combat athlete. And I think that starts with, as the beginning, the MMA foundation of conditioning, timing, muscular, like I always see you training tremendously amazing ways to your body, with your strength, your stretching. I was inspired by one of your videos or like about mobility, and I'm like, well, I gotta start doing my windmills. That's important. Your body is your temple, and if you think you can survive a violent encounter without taking care of your vessel, you're smoking crack. If you think you can survive a violent encounter without resistance training, you're smoking crack. The problem is, like you said, resistance training tends to be too focused. So this is where we start, but then let's make the resistance training include all other variables, 2-on-1. In my training with my old instructor, we'd have gang war, which would be 10-on-10, or, he'd be like 10-on-2. And he's like, your goal over here, survive. Yeah. You can run away, that's fine, but you got to survive. Your goal is survive. So you change the dynamics, and suddenly people are thinking, and like I said, you're an expert in physical conditioning. The body adapts to certain exercises and it becomes very easy. So if you do the same exercise over and over again, you get less value. But if you consistently change the paradigms of training, okay, we're doing 2-on-1 now. Okay, we're doing bladed grappling with the same foundational concepts of leverage and things like that. The body starts thinking and more adapting, and it starts opening your mind to, how can I adapt to this circumstance with the stuff I know and make myself survive? But like you said, you never know. So the first thing is awareness of what the situation is, right? And that's very important to train.
Yeah.
This is almost non-existent. And I have to say, I have so much respect for you. You're such a great trainer because everything you say is brilliant, but most people are not like you. That it's too hard. And also the students find it too hard. So it's like almost economically not viable to be truthful and train your students properly, right?
That is true.
Yeah, especially when my rent is $17,000 a month in New York. Got a post-pandemic little break, but my studio is $17,000 a month. That's a lot of cash, right? Yeah. So there's a pressure for me to sell out every day and just teach some crappy bullshit. Oh, here's your rank. Rather than give my students honesty. But I personally can't do that, because it's also would be insane, right? I like effectiveness and like to see my students. And it's not just that I have integrity, which I think I do, but it's not just that. It's also like, I would just shoot myself because I just hate crap, right? I hate things that don't work. Like You know, if you see
Yeah.
something that doesn't work, you want to fix it, right?
My,
But
my my ex-wife used to tell me all the time that, back when we were married, it's a long time ago, it's like, you have to be more commercial, you have to be more commercial. And she was right. I was never commercial enough. It's gotten better over the years, but I will still never be as wealthy as some of the people that you see online selling their self-defense scores for whatever, and doing a lot of, in my opinion, shady marketing. But again, there's a market for that, and if that's what people want to do, I'm a-okay with that. It's a big world. It's just that a lot of stuff that I write or make videos about, the market will be smaller because it doesn't cater to fantasies. So, and then you end up, it's a choice. Every instructor has to make these choices or find a compromise. And I want to get back to what you said. And I think there's an advantage and a disadvantage to what you say. Like you take, so the criterion is that it has to work in high level MMA, and then we look at how does it work in self-defense and so on. Um, I, I think it's a good basis nowadays because, and I've written about this years ago when I saw the evolution happen. The UFC, when it started, there were senators trying to ban it. It was not what it is now. By far, it's been 30 plus years, but nobody, a lot of people were totally against that, and they tried to get rid of it. It didn't take, and now it's one of the biggest sports on earth. But I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah. So over the past 30 years, it basically replaced martial arts, kickboxing, boxing, Muay Thai, or whatever you want, as kind of the paradigm for what people on average think is a fight is like, in particular younger people. But then again, younger also mean not just teenagers, but 20s and even 30 somethings, because they grew up with that stuff for the past 30 years. And I've seen this, I saw this happen years ago and more and more. And I just recently saw this young kid, and he's maybe 12, 13. He gets into this argument with a woman. He gets up close and he dives in for a double leg takedown, tries to do ground and pound. The paradigm for so many people nowadays is an MMA fight. Like if there's violence, self-defense, street fight, doesn't matter. You do takedowns, you do ground and pound, you this, you do that. So they have this very different idea. 60, 70 years ago, it was boxing, maybe wrestling as well.
I wish that were true. And in New York, it was Jackie Chan. It wasn't boxing. It's funny. Most people thought like, oh, street fight's going to look like, like Chinese Kung Fu.
Oh, no. I mean, like 60, 70 years ago, way before we were
Oh,
born. Like,
yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
like, like
yeah.
Asian martial arts were not really well known back then. But what was known in the West? Wrestling and boxing. That was like the combat sports of that era. So there is definitely, I think, if you're not training self-defense against like a double leg takedown, even a clumsy one, you're missing out, because that is what a lot of people will revert to, even if they have zero training. It's just that they've seen UFC fights, they've watched YouTube videos, and they're like, okay, this is apparently what you do. You throw a big haymaker and then you dive for the legs. So I think that is that is very valuable. The other thing is, and this is a long discussion that I've had with a friend of mine, who's also a New Yorker, by the way, we've been talking for decades now. And I'll give you the example, and you're going to be aware of that. The old PKA kickboxing style. So you get, the Bill Wallace guys of the world, and this and that, who I tremendous respect for, still have his books here, used to train his system. But you weren't allowed to give leg kicks, no kicks below the waist. So what happened is that, these guys were excellent at that. And over here in Europe, we developed kickboxing with leg kicks. And I remember, because I was a teenager back then, and I would read the magazines and this and that, interviews with American champions. And they're like, yeah, so you're coming over to fight with leg kicks. Like, okay, so how do you see this? Well, it's not a big deal. We'll just side kick over it. They won't be able to touch us, and, blah, 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 blah. Consistently what happened, they got their legs kicked off and they lost this fight. Not all of them, but the vast majority of them. And that was one different rule. One technique was added, and the whole game changed. Everything you did you had to rethink completely. And the same thing happened with the UFC. A lot of people from different combat sports came in, and they're like, you don't have a ground game, you're going to get messed up. You need to know grappling on the ground, and in particular, you need to do something about those BJJ guys because they know they know what they're doing there, and you don't, so you're screwed. So and then that's another thing that's added. Back in the day, back in the Pride days, soccer kicks to the head were allowed when you're lying on the ground. Totally, you didn't just pull guard. You didn't, because you knew he was going to kick your head in or stomp you, like Vanderlei Silva in his highlight reels, just him stomping this guy in a corner. It's like, okay, I don't want to be on the ground. If I go to the ground, he needs to come with me because otherwise I'm screwed. Which, as it's illegal now, I was like, oh no, same thing.
Illegal in the UFC, but one FC.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that's for the
exactly, right? And it's different there. Better. In the UFC, the rule of the downed opponent, the grounded fighter, when you when you put a hand on the floor, it's like it used to be just the fingertips, which was bullshit. You put your fingertips on the floor. No, you can't kick him or knee him in the head anymore. Like, this has zero relevance to self-defense. Quite on the contrary, but we saw fighters leaning up against the cage, trying to touch the floor with a fingertip just so the guy would stop kneeing him in the face. And that's what I mean with specialization changes technique, changes mindsets, changes strategy and tactics. So then you have to take that, the highest level of the sport is also the highest level of specialization, because they train only for that. John Jones doesn't train specifically for self-defense. I mean, he's fucked now with his back torn off. So, but like, pick any top UFC guy or one championship guy or Bellator, doesn't matter. He is training specifically for this rule set because he needs to excel at that. He doesn't have time to train anything else, barring Valentina Shevchenko, because she does pistol shooting competitions. But I don't know she's a special kind of woman, I guess.
I'll give you an example then. So that's a great point and a great example. So Demetrius Johnson went from the UFC to ONE FC.
Yep.
And he forgot about the need to a down opponent. And he was like thought in a position with one of second or third fight, I forget. He was fighting.
I forget his name, but I saw it.
Yeah. And he's a Brazilian guy, and he's like, "Oh, I'm okay here." Boom! He hit the knee, and he was just unconscious, and that makes a difference. So you're absolutely right. MMA is the place to start for me, but it's never the place to finish. And for me, we don't train MMA. We train always with the Vale Tudo context, because even in the UFC, especially with certain countries, fighters who are highly motivated to win, but they cheat all the time. There's one, he looks at the ref, he sees where it is, and then he takes his thumb and puts it in the eye to escape the guillotine. And you literally see him looking from the guillotine where the ref is, moves his opponent, and pokes the other guy down. It's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry," but he got out of the guillotine. And the ref didn't see anything. Yeah. The ref's like, "Oh, okay, we'll restart standing." So I never train that specifically in the sense of like, I'm going to expose myself to foul technique because the rules don't allow, right? Like I always say, hey, this is where the guy could bite you. He could stick his finger in your eye. He could grab your groin. There's this great video, again, of a guy jumping a guillotine in an army barracks, because, US Army guys do a lot of jiu-jitsu stuff now. And I was a Marine barracks. And the other guy, before he landed, again, he grabbed his testicles. And it was the guillotine versus testicle grab. And the guy came,
let go my dick. I saw it.
Yeah. And so it's a conversation if you're a responsible martial artist who puts on his door self-defense. It's a conversation you must have with your students. However, I believe that mixed martial arts has really contributed to the martial art landscape, because before MMA, the vision of what a street fight looked like was largely fantasy, whether it was Jackie Chan or like crappy boxing, or like most what people thought was what fights would look like, and in their head. And what it really was there was a very, very large disconnect. And the UFC was a needed dose of reality. That being said, is UFC a street fight? Of course not. It's not. But it is closer than every other combat sport that came before it, other than like death matches and somewhere, right? You know, like somewhere, but I mean, like legitimate combat sport that we all can see on TV or whatever, have access to. You know, there's no combat sport that's closer to reality that exists today than the mixed martial art. But is that a place to end? No, it's just a place to start. But all your points I completely agree with. Super specialization is the death of real martial arts knowledge. Yep. Hyper specialization. But the interesting thing is that people who are successful in the UFC are never the Olympic. Well, there's a couple examples of the latter, but usually it's not the Olympic gold medalist in judo or the Olympic judo guy or the Olympic wrestling guy or the Olympic boxer or the highest level type. It's the B-level guys below that. Now, Henry Cejudo is a accountant. Yeah. And so is Matt Lindland. But other than Henry Cejudo and Matt Lindland, there are very few examples of guys at the highest level of wrestling transitioning to MMA successfully. There have been many attempts. There's no example of someone who is an incredibly high-level boxer in terms of awards, right? Awards like say Mayweather, going into MMA being successful. There's even D1 All-Americans are not as successful as people like John Jones, who are very, very good wrestlers, but not at the elite, because what the elite is exactly what you said, hyper specialization. They're not so specialized that they can't think outside of their wrestling rule set. For example, like there's a way to make those mini scores in freestyle wrestling that, you know, would be like, don't give back exposure, things like that. It's all terrible to do in MMA, but if you drill them over and over and over and over and over again, so you win the Olympics, right?
Yeah.
You're going to do it. You're going to do it and you're going to get killed. And you can see an example of, what's his name? Who did it? An example of, oh, can you give me 1 second? Do you mind? Hold 1 second.
A few moments later.
Hyper specialization is the opposite of being an adaptive Swiss Army. And if you're a martial art interested in self-defense, again, you need to be an adaptive athlete that has tools in multiple dimensions and can adjust those tools to the variety of circumstances you can feel. And your number one goal should be survival, not, you know, yo, I'm going to fucking kick your, like your goal should be in a 3-on-1 situation. How can I get the hell out of here? Right? And your goal in a bladed situation is get the freaking hell out of there, or find a way to pick up an improvised weapon, but use the skills I know to survive, but not go on autopilot and play that hyper specialized game that gets you killed.
Well, my thing is that what I believe that you cannot be both the best specialist and the best generalist. That's impossible. You can't be the best sprinter and the best marathon runner because they're on polar opposites. And in many ways, self-defense is a polar opposite to combat sports. There's obviously overlap, right? And then we get back to what people are tired of me of talking about, that what I invented, Randy's law. Differences are just as important as the similarities. And I think that's something that is very difficult to figure out once we get to self-defense, because somebody's life is on the line. And that's the biggest issue for me, is that you're going to have to make choices. Now, there's nothing wrong with say like, look, you know, I'm just going to focus on my combat sports. It's MMA, and I am an MMA coach, so I'm all in favor of the sport. That's going to give me sufficient overlap to, when a guy comes at me, I'm just going to punch him or I can do this and that. Or if I end up grappling, I know what to do. I'm like, dude, good for you. That's great. And I agree up to a certain point. If you've been training in MMA for, you know, let's say 4 or 5 years, you've done a bunch of hard sparring sessions over those years. You've been punched in the face, kicked and this and that, thrown to the ground, had to escape chokes and all that kind of stuff. You know, you're used to some rough and tumble. And if then you have some good awareness, you've been around the block a few times, you can see when somebody's setting you up for a sucker punch and so on, you've got a really good chance of being able to handle yourself. But that's not everybody. So then we have to, like you said, how do we teach this to people so that they have a good chance if they only come in 3 times a week? And then for me, it's also how do I teach all this kind of stuff to people, like we talked in the beginning, have been living in a very safe society, whose most of their ideas of violence is from TV and movies, and they are not used to the harsh realities of violence and life when we're not in that safe environment. And we talked about the generation that has safe spaces and trigger warnings and this and that. I'm like, the guy who wants to rob you and basically clobber you over the head with a heavy object, he's not going to ask you your pronouns. And I'm
Yes.
sorry if that offends you, but that is reality. And you may find that offensive, and you may be very upset about that. He still doesn't care.
Completely agree with you. So example, like I teach self-defense as well. And some of the critiques from the feminist perspective, which I'm a feminist and I agree with a lot of what they say, is that we shouldn't teach self-defense. We should teach men to be better. Yes, of course we should do that. But the two are not diametrically opposed. Now we're going to have insurance. I don't drive my car to get into an accident, but I have insurance because the world is a cruel, unforgiving place. Yes, we should strive to be better people, but be prepared for those of our society that don't give a crap about anything other than hurting you, because 1 in 10 people have serious psychological issues, right? 1 in 10 human beings have some sort of serious psychological issues, and 3 in 10 have some sort of like lower level, kind of like depression or things like that. So out of 10 people, 3 people are going to be slightly imbalanced. If you meet 100 people in a day, which you could if you travel on a highly, population dense area, you're going to encounter in those 100 people, at least 10 that are psychopath and have no care for your well-being. That's something we have to understand. So yes, we could have to be a better place, but at the same time, it's insurance. But I would disagree with you to a point about this. Now, I'm disagreeing, but I really have no right to disagree because I don't have it. However,
because I missed that.
You don't have that, because you can have an opinion and I can have an opinion, and our opinions mean bullshit. What was true is data. So I think my goal is to find how we can be combat specific, but in a ways that allow competitiveness in general. Meaning, like, for example, you said marathon and sprint. So yes, you can't be the best world-class sprinter, but if you retire from sprinting after you did sprinting and you also train your body to do long distance running, lifting, this and that, you can be very, very healthy, right? So post your small competitive, career, the rest of your life can be something more dedicated to something holistic. However, I don't know. Maybe they can. I don't know. But I will say this. Did you see what's his name? Rokas's the Ultimate Self-Defense Championship?
Yeah, a little bit.
Very interesting. So, no, I mean, are there problems with the competition? Yes. But what they did is they had very different series of challenges in different self-defense environments. Because when you say self-defense, it could be thousands of different things. Self-defense could encompass you being on the battlefield in Ukraine. Self-defense could be encompass you, heading off some, gangbangers, or like, there's so infinite permutations of human violence. But he had a lot of different segments, like the office, sexual harassment. You must protect someone. You have, a violent encounter based on verbal violence, but not physical, and how do you diffuse? Get a lot of different things. Now, the person who won out, had the highest score, was the person who had absolutely no self-defense training. He was just an MMA fighter. But the guys who did the self-defense training wound up failing a lot of the challenges, which tells you that maybe training for self-defense is not the answer. Training yourself to be, first, a competent athlete. Also, like you said, absolutely agree. Finding ritual and meaning in human self-control. So I think the best thing is having a little bit of humility, self-awareness, and staying away. Oh, fuck you. Yeah, you know what? Fuck you. No. Okay. Oh, I'm so sorry. Let me find ways of disengaging and talking this situation down, right? Where there was the one where the guy asked for the wallet, and one person said, "Oh yeah, here's my wallet," instead of fighting. Very smart move. Very smart. If you can give your wallet, give your wallet. This is a wonderful thing to test different situations and see who comes out on top. Obviously, it's not scientific because it was just 10 guys with this, but there's already some data that's showing that one of the perfect examples. I'm not trying to crap on this guy because I really respect him, but he was a self-defense trained, the Australian guy, and he gets pinned in one of the things, and he's in no danger whatsoever. But the claustrophobia of being in the helmet and pinned, he taps out to nothing, to absolutely nothing. What does he tap out? Because he has not developed that combat athlete self-control of your panic response, your adrenaline response. He hasn't developed that. So he's like, I just couldn't breathe. And you know what? We see that every day in combat athletics. If you can't control your panic response, man, good luck. And the best way to control it is not even boxing. I hate to say it because, it sounds like I'm pushing myself, but is to get pinned by big fat dudes, right? And women, this is very important. Put a big fat dude between their legs and pin them. And the minute that's every woman first thinks I'm being, right? Yep. So then after control, okay, let's relax. Okay, establish some sort of protective guard and then try to get away or kick the guy or sweep him or whatever, right? But you could see the guys with the self-defense training didn't do well. And the guy, Jeff Chad, who never practiced knife defense at all, actually did pretty well compared to his peer group in the knife defense. Now, he made a couple mistakes and won, and he got jacked up and stabbed. But with a tiny bit of training, I could take him for 20 minutes and don't do that, do this. I could make him 300% more effective because he's already a combat athlete. So I think, yes, your specialist is, how long are you going to compete in MMA? Like I have guys, and they're going to compete for maybe 5 years in their return. Okay, you got 5 years of being an athlete like you did. You competed in the world stage in Sandai, were amazing, but then you dedicated yourself to something new. And I think that's the path. Is like find your best self in a specialized environment that creates athletic tension. And then, after a few years of that, we still compete in that format, but we also broaden it to a lot of other things, and we develop our Swiss Army.
Yeah. Well,
anyway, that's fine.
No, and I understand your approach. The way I see it is that the analogy that I gave of the sprinter and the marathon runner is, and I agree with you. If you've been a sprinter for X amount of years, you're like, I'm done with that. I'm gonna go into long distance running and do a bunch of other stuff. And I'm like, yes, I agree. However, it's called a side principle, specific adaptations to impose demands. Your body adapts to specific stimuli, not general, not just like, oh, I'm doing cardiovascular work. No. You're doing very specific cardiovascular work that requires specific adaptations. Those adaptations do not just change overnight when you change training modalities. And that is, for me, is the big key, is the more you specify one direction, the harder it becomes to go the other direction.
You're 100% right. And you can see that when high-level grapplers try to strike and they're absolute garbage because their body, just shoulders can't move right. So you're right. I think that's why you don't want to be hyper-specialized for too long. But then you get guys like Henry Cejudo, who is a gold medalist, who is now insanely good striker, or Islam Makhachev, who was a wrestler all his life. But it also, I think, again, it comes down to the right trainer and body dynamics. Like the way the Soviet way of training the body was never hyper specialized until you're about 10 years old, and you create athletic bodies based on gymnastics, and they never leave that. So if you look at Khabib, you look at Makhachev, you look at George St. Pierre, right? These are people who didn't hyper develop that grappling shoulders, right? Like back in the day, one of my favorite people, I love this guy. I learned from him. I respect him so much. Dean Lister. I have nothing but love and respect for him. Great fighter. But Dean Lister's striking in MMA, I don't want to be bad. He's a good dude, but it wasn't the highest level, right? Love him to death. But there's a room for improvement, right? Because he's so hyper adapted this, that he couldn't do that.
He's massive.
Yeah. And that was for you exactly what you said. Specific body adaptations to specific, very highly specific stimuli. This guy was an Abu Dhabi champion three times. And
he was like undefeated, or he didn't have to tap for like 10 years or something.
Yeah, exactly. Like
until the Josh Barnett fight that he had, that was like fucking impressive as hell. But that was like 10 years that he never tapped.
And to that project, people don't realize that Dean Lister had an injured neck when he fought that fight.
Oh, okay, I didn't know.
So he should, in a healthy Dean Lister would have never tapped there.
Yeah.
And I love Dean Lister. I trained with him. I love him to death. I'm not trying to trash him, but in the UFC, he did not get to the highest levels because he was too hyper adapted to grappling. Yeah. So I completely agree with what you're saying. So as I'm teaching my students, I try not to deform their bodies into hyper adaptability, which is kind of why I started MMA, because MMA is not wrestling, right? There's enough of different stimuli where you're generalized, but you don't get this as much. You don't get the lean karate type, which is the tall and lanky Machida type, where you're just tagging, right? You get something in between, and there's always some way to train the body in different stimuli. But if I started a guy 20 years in wrestling, and then he said, okay, let's teach you how to punch, I guarantee that it would be incredibly hard for him to learn it. But like I have a student, I won't say his name, great guy, but he punches like this.
Yeah.
Right? He is incapable of doing this, of turning his shoulders. He punches, for the people who are not watching the video, I'm turning my body like a zombie, right? What you should use, you have to have hip rotation, but he's so stiff with his shoulders and from years of wrestling and weightlifting that it's very difficult for him. And so what we're trying to do is develop much more mobility. So I have him doing tons and tons of mobility work, and we're starting to see the difference right now. But it took a good.
It takes a while.
2 years. Yeah,
and for me, it's not just the physical adaptations, but it's also everything else. It's just the way you do techniques, the strategy, the tactics that you use, your instincts. Like if you've been, watch the early UFCs. So how did the Gracies get a takedown when they were initiating it? They would fake high and go low, or they would fake high and go low. And if they were really sneaky about it, they'd fake high and go low. That was pretty much the whole strategy. And it worked because nobody had takedown defense. Until X amount of years later, you would see that, people were figuring out how to do that, and then they had to change and adapt and this and that. Now we're to the point that I think the last Gracie in the UFC is Kron Gracie, who had a horrible fight, and he got nowhere. And my point is that, and then we get to specialization and then hyper specialization. UFC started because of the Gracies, because that was their vehicle that they helped put together to promote their art, and they were massively successful in the first, let's say, 5 to 10 years, maybe 15, depends on how you want to look at it. But like now, there's none left, and the ones that are left are having a very, very hard time because everybody has caught up to maybe not be as good in the ground as they are, but they've got everything else there as well.
I completely disagree. Everything you're saying is correct, but I see it in a different way. One, Kron Gracie does not represent the Gracie family. He represents modern Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu sport training, which took over from 1996.
That's fair.
Right?
That's fair.
And the original Gracie family members, like, let's time travel, take Hickson from 1993, and you put him in the UFC today. Obviously, it would be harder, but he wouldn't do the worst possible performance of any grappler ever that Kron Gracie did, which was just awful. He would not do that performance because he's more adapted to it. Like he trained for Valentudo. the generations to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu changed. It changed to a hyper-specialized format of sportive competition. The early 80s Jiu-Jitsu guys, they did some Jiu-Jitsu tournaments, but they were always like, the goal is Vale Tudo and self-defense. The sport Jiu-Jitsu is just this way to get in shape and have some fun, right? But the goal was, so they were better.
That's a really good point that you made. So is there anybody who does represent that style?
Charles Oliveira. Charles Oliveira never walked into a sport jiu-jitsu tournament ever. He always trained fighting jiu-jitsu, and he's the #1 submission fighter in the UFC.
But I mean, like, is he a Gracie guy? Because I don't know.
I mean, but he trains Brazilian jiu-jitsu. But his jiu-jitsu has always been in. I would also say, I mean, if you look at American Top Team was founded by Conan Silveira, and he left, but originally, I forgot his name. Anyway, they founded it, but they're Carlson Gracie students, and they were fighting Vale Tudo. American Top Team is one of the most successful MMA camps around. Now, are they Gracies? No, because Gracies are just happy counting their money, right? Right? But do they represent the Carlson Gracie lineage, which was the best prepared for Vale Tudo? And you said back in the day, if you wanted to be good at Vale Tudo, you saw Carlson, right? Look at Stipe Miocic, the gym Strong Style. Strong Style is a Carlson Gracie affiliate. Okay, if you actually go to Demetrius Johnson's camp, which is a hybrid, his teacher Matt Hume is of course a Japanese shoot fighter, and always Jap shoot fighting is MMA grappling, right? But also they have a link to the Carlson Gracie lineage through Marcelo Alonso. Then you look at AKA. That now they had Leo Vieira there too, but they had some people of the Carlson Gracie. Like if you look at the very successful mixed martial art teams today, many of them have links to the old Carlson Gracie theories, which are still very viable. That being said, they evolve. A car is a car, but a 1980s Oldsmobile is not a 2023 Tesla. However, they're still a car. So conceptually similar, but evolved. So what I think is conceptually, what the Gracies were doing in the 80s, not the 90s, but the 80s was very, very good. But of course, we need to evolve. We need to evolve. We need to move forward and see what works better. Like Khabib does this thing where he triangles up the legs after the double leg. You know, the first time I saw that was 1994, maybe, in Japan. And the Brazilian fighter came and fought in the shooter in Japan and rocked the guys up. So Khabib's not doing anything new. He's just evolving it better.
Yeah.
Right? And he added in the Dagestani handcuff, he added in the Leo Vieira passing. I also there's a video of Rickson Gracie sparring, no-gi, and doing the Leo Vieira passing system that I discussed. Before Leo Vieira was even a white belt. But I think he just conceptually understood that it was good. But he didn't systematize it. But people were understanding, given this input and this situation, like-minded critical thinkers will all come out over here. But this thing over here can also be evolved, right? So the conceptual framework of the Vale Tudo fighters from the 80s is still very valid. However, it's not quite as evolved as it could be.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you, how does George St. Pierre hit his takedowns, who has still one of the highest percentage successes? Or how did Khabib hit his takedowns? High, low. It's the same. It's just evolved version, right? Yeah. They get better hands, but George St. Pierre was high, low. Khabib was high, low. So the theory is the same. It's just they're better, right?
Well, the reason why I phrased it the way as I did is that let's put it this way. I remember seeing an interview with Krohn many years ago, and when he said, "I'm going to do MMA," and they asked, "Okay, so where are you going for your striking?" "Oh, we have all the striking that I need in our jiu-jitsu." I think it was on Joe Rogan, and he was like, "Oh, really?" And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, so if one thing I think we can say is true is that I think that Gracie Jiu-Jitsu was not known for its striking. When you look at compared to boxing, kickboxing, Muay Thai, and so on, which specializes in striking, right? So I think that's a fair assessment.
Interrupt. Elliot Gracie had a nasty right cross.
Oh yeah, no, I believe
Right.
it.
I mean, so it wasn't like they ignored it. And that stomp, the stomp kick, the little chassé, you know, the stomp on the knee. Who does that? John Jones, right? You know, like those are legit techniques where they as refined as the modern guys. No, but conceptually they weren't bad. They just
I'm not saying they didn't have any striking. I'm just saying that compared to all the other striking styles that exist, it was pretty limited. But despite that, in the early UFCs, you know, the Gracies that you had Royce Gracie, you had Hickson, over in Japan and so on, did it exceptionally well. I'm not saying that Hickson didn't know how to strike. I'm saying that he wasn't known for his striking compared to his grappling.
Yeah, of course.
If he had to choose, I think he'd take a guy to the ground as opposed to stay standing. Which, from as far as I remember, all his fights, they pretty much always ended up on the ground, and that's where he won. So that's what I meant with the hyper specialization. That's their thing. Yes, striking, yes, and takedowns and defense, and how you set that up with the stomp kick and with the fakes. I agree, but they were hyper specialized. And then you have to, like you say, adapt, evolve, and this and that is difficult to do. It's difficult to do if you're hyper specialized and you see that everything's changing. And then we have to be fair to them as well. Early UFCs, hardly any rules, hardly anything. Pretty much almost anything went. UFC today, there are no rules, quote unquote, but there's many fouls, which is complete not a nonsense because you're not allowed to do this and that. Well, that's a rule. Actually, it's not a foul. It's just like it's a rule. We have the gear. We've got the gloves that are there, which changes how you grapple.
Yeah, everything. Yeah.
So that's what I meant with when you look at hyper specialization and then overlap with other sports, is that it gets to be tricky. It gets to be this whole thing where there's so many variables that you have to look at that it gets to be difficult to see, okay, like how much value do I place on this variable? How much weight do I give it in the overall equation? And then the other aspect is that if people want like, okay, I'm René, I'm going to come to your gym 3 times a week. I want to be able to defend myself, this and that. And I want to be sure that I can defend myself. And then as an self-defense instructor, what do we have to say? Well, if you're looking for a guarantee, that doesn't exist when it comes to violence. So there's a whole chaos theory aspect of it. Is where violence is chaos in action, and it's your job to create order out of that chaos. Because there's all this stuff is happening all at the same time. It can overwhelm you, and it's difficult, but tough shit. It's your job to structure this stuff and handle it. I'm a really big believer in systems. I know in styles. I know you just said earlier that you're not. I am. I think you're just creating your own style. That would be from everything you said.
I believe in systems. I don't believe in styles. And I think
okay. What's the difference for you?
A system is how we systematically, how we organizationally break down ways to get advantages.
Yeah.
Right? Regardless of style is some larger marketing ploy. Like karate had no styles until they went to Japan. The Okinawa karate, they would be like, oh, you're a guy from Naha. Hey, you kind of do this. Hey, you're a guy from Shuri. You do this. But we all train with each other. We learn. But then they all went to Japan and they're like, okay, well, we got to have a name so we can market it, we can sell. A lot of styles are modern creations of the commercial state. And they tend to reinforce closed-minded thinking. Now, systems are, given this situation, how can I take multiple points of attack, leverage, off balancing and control in synergistic ways to create advantages for myself, whether that advantage is striking, whether it's grappling, whether it's whatever. There are ways to use the different weapons at hand synergistically and tactically in ways that are highly logical. Those are systems. And each position, there are many systems in different arts. Some of these systems are specific, sport-specific, and bullshit in their life. Or some of them really work well or have to be adapted. But I think an art is a collection of some number of subsystems. Or sometimes it's not. I mean, NAR could just be a name too, but
Okay.
generally speaking,
Okay. Yeah, I used the definition a little bit different. I would say that for me, a style would be like a, a branch of a bigger tree. So you've got all the kung fu styles, and that style is this branch, and they're all Chinese martial arts. And we can have like subdivisions of subdivisions, and I would call that styles. Like in Tai Chi Chuan, we call it practical Tai Chi Chuan or Wudang Tai Chi Chuan, but there's Chen style, there's Sun style, there's Yang style, and so on. And these also have different branches. So that's the way that I would define a style, as like a subsection of a larger whole, who all have the same characteristics like you described of a system. They have a way of viewing things, they have a way of organizing things and principles, and or even maybe laws, like we always do this, we never do that, and so on. So I view it more that way. I understand what you say, like a lot of styles are bullshit because they're marketing inventions, but I think it predates like modern marketing. A lot of what I would call styles.
You know, I'll tell you, because honestly, it doesn't. Because even in the Middle Ages, people market. Like you look at Fiore, right? He's like, "Oh, this is my Fiore system," because he wanted to.
Yeah,
You know,
that's why I said modern marketing.
Yeah. Or even like the martial arts instructors, like, yeah, I'm this guy because I have this name, and you know, people need to make money. That hasn't changed. But I would say this: I don't deal in styles. I deal in two things: Newtonian physics and applied anatomy, and how that applies to the human geometry of the moment. So you have 2 arms and 2 legs. I have 2 arms and 2 legs. Right now we're unarmed and we're facing each other in this angle. What laws of physics apply? Gravity, inertia, power generation, and what angles am I creating to use the human body's knowledge of the human body against the applied anatomy, right? Okay, liver shot. You know, liver shot will drop you. I know. So I know, you know, if I hit you in the back of the head or behind the ear or the jaw or the temple, that's good, right? If I hit you on the shoulder, probably won't do it, right? So I understand anatomy, I understand applied physics, and I understand the human geometry of the moment. So once we put a name on things, I think we just become closed-minded. For me, I want to look at the data of what's going on at the highest level and also on street fighting, for sure. And then find out how I can think about human anatomy and physics in the best possible ways. And when I put a label on it, like karate, for me, that means I'm not going to draw from some. Or if I put a name on it, jiu-jitsu, I'm not going to draw from Dutch kickboxing. I'm going to do what works in that specific piece of human geometry.
Yeah.
You know, right? And I, you know, like, you know, that's kind of how I look at it. And I think styles blind us because we become very parochial and very defensive of our style. That being said, understanding where we came from and respecting that and saying, hey, I learned from this guy is a great thing. That's not a bad thing. But let's, you know.
I come from a very different tradition, and you have this very often in Chinese system. Well, just people who practice Chinese martial arts, and it used to be like that in China. Even though we could still argue, I'm just going to generalize for sake of arguments.
Do you mind if I start eating my lunch?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm like really starving.
Yeah, go.
Is that gonna mess up?
No. You're good. I'm
like
just gonna note the time. Yeah, that's fine. I forgot what time it is on your end. You're not supposed to starve, René.
I haven't eaten all day, and
oh Jesus Christ! I'm sorry.
No worries. I'm sorry. I don't mean to like be rude.
Dude, go ahead. I mean, I've eaten my dinner hours ago, so I'm okay. I'm not insulted at all. This is a lot of fun. This is a lot of fun. I'm sorry that it took so long to ask you again. I just, you know, I space out. I talk to so many people, and I forget, like, oh yeah, I want to talk to this guy again. And
you're the best. You're the absolute best. I love learning from you and discussing things. And I think we come from different points of view, but we're all seeking honesty in what we do, and I think that's beautiful. That we can kind of like navigate these conversations from different points, and I can learn from you, And, maybe your listeners can gain something from these.
I mean, and I learned too, and it's just that, like you said, you have a very different perspective, different experiences, and so on. One of the things that I was fortunate to realize before I was too old and get too set in my ways was that nobody knows everything about violence, and the first person who doesn't know everything is me. My Facebook group is called "You Are Not Ares, God of War" for a reason, because there needs to be a whole lot more of that kind of attitude in martial arts and self-defense circles, as opposed to like, well, my sensei said this or my coach said that, and he is champion of the world or whatever. I'm like, doesn't matter, he can still be wrong. Or he used to be right, but things have changed, or yes, he's right in this context, but not in that one. And in that regard, I think it's just a matter of figuring out how that you can just like you said, be humble, be a little bit humble, and it's like, okay, I'm not the be all end all. I've got my experience, I've got my training, got my this, my that, and you're like, and it worked for me, and it's working for my students. I think if you can say that, that's really good. But I've seen guys, I mean, I suck at Taekwondo. It was never my thing. I've seen guys being incredibly, efficient in doing Taekwondo in self-defense situations. Okay, that's my dog. I don't know if you can hear that. I think she's a little bit stuck. Can you hear that? Okay, that's typically when in her throat there's something a little bit stuck.
Oh, no. Oh, please take care of it.
No, it's okay. It's just this I forget what it's called in English. It's just this part of the anatomy that's a little bit twisted, and she's good. She's going back to sleep. It's just like I wanted to say, understanding that just because somebody has a different perspective or a totally different way of viewing things, and I would never do it, doesn't mean that it's wrong.
I think that's wonderful. And I would say this is the heart of most self-defense training, is that you're not a psychopath and I'm not a psychopath.
Well, some people would differ when it comes to me. They would disagree with you on that, but
we don't go out and seek conflict on a daily basis. So our data sets are very limited.
Yeah.
And when you're dealing with the limited data set, the conclusions you draw can be valid within that limited data set and limited specific circumstance.
Yeah.
So this is the issue, is like, yeah, it worked for you in that one situation, but you have things like called survivor bias, right? Where it did work, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best thing to do. So for me, especially people, you would go up in a decent area, with not a lot of violence. You're not looking for altercations on a daily basis. So your set of experiences that inform your training are by its nature limited to the sterile setting of the dojo, which is not anywhere near self-defense. And padded walls, mat, or maybe a hardwood floor, no obstacles, no knife, or a padded knife. I mean, we're not trying to murder each other in the dojo, right? So it's very important that we understand the limitations of our data set, because you as one human being, and it could work very, very well for you or very well for me, but it may not work for someone else. And that's an important distinction. Someone else may be the majority of the human population, because you could be very much an outlier. If you're 8 feet tall and really long legs and hyper flexible hips, you know what? Maybe a jumping spinning back kick is not bad, but majority of the human population will not have that experience. If you're 5'2", like I was training with this guy, he's 5'2", and he was about 100 kilos, a little over 100 kilos, right? A big human block. 5'2" is how many in meters?
It's not that tall. It's not tall.
Yeah, it's like
160 or something, I think.
Yeah, 150 centimeters.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, and 100 kilos. The amount of power that guy could generate from across is absolutely insane, even with poor technique. Yeah. Right? And he was also, funny enough, he was incredibly lower body flexible. Like, you're like, what?
Yeah.
He's this block that could do a full Van Damme squat. So, but the majority of the population doesn't look like him, right?
Yeah.
And can't do what he does because of genetics. So we have to find understanding that our data sets are limited. So we must seek out larger data to, if we decide to draw larger conclusions,
Yeah.
which means self-defense videos, sports competition, and do analysis of what is it generally a good thing, because everybody can have an opinion, but they're colored by a bias. And this is the other thing I don't like about styles, is inertia. So we're talking about the Gracies. So the Gracies were, yes, they were pioneers, but now there's certain things that in combative Gracie jiu-jitsu, this is the style that Henner Gracie teaches, which is like street oriented, which is generally like not a bad thing to do, you know? But there are things that could be really updated, and they're not. Why? Because Henner has an emotional connection. Henner Gracie, those guys have a very strong emotional connection to their grandfather. So it's not just a technique, it's a technique that my grandfather taught. So to throw it out in favor of something that is new is very emotionally hard. It feels like you're betraying the family. And when you put a name on something, suddenly you become a bit of a preservationist. Meaning, is this authentically Gracie? Is this authentically? Fuck authenticity. Is it anatomically and in terms of Newtonian physics the best option for this human geometry? Period. So that's one of the reasons why I don't like to discuss style. That being said, this gives people, human beings, a very strong sense of comfort and identity. So most people love to label what they do as a style because it's like a soft, warm blanket around your shoulders that feels great. Yes, I know the style is 100 years old, and my master, Chen Manching or something, did this and this and this, and there's this whole spiel, and it feels intellectually and psychologically very comforting, particularly if you suck shit. Right? And that's not to say that people have any specific style. This is true.
Yeah. I get what you say, but I see it differently. I see it like, maybe an analogy would be like computer languages. You can program in C++, you can program in Python, you could program in Pascal if you really want to, and you've got a really old computer, and they're all, you know, computer languages that work for specific things. For specific things.
Do they?
To a certain degree. Some are better at certain things than others, and so on. I would not want to code anything in Pascal nowadays.
It depends on your hardware. So my wife.
Yes.
So
and that's my point.
If you tried to run Fortran on a modern computer, it wouldn't work. So there's a time to throw away the languages of the past. If the goal is not preservation, but modern. Like if you went to a job interview and said, yes, I program in C++ Pascal. They're like, what about JavaScript? What about this? I'm like, I don't know. They're like, goodbye. So are you talking preservation or are you talking functionality?
Oh,
right.
Well, well, that's my point, is that some languages are better at some things than others. And there will, I'm guessing that there's always going to be new computer languages that get developed over time as hardware evolves, as the needs evolve, and so on. And I think that's the biggest thing for me is that if you look at it, that it's more like this is a system that is really good at that, totally blows at something else. The analogy that I also often use is like, okay, let's look at fighting style self-defense systems, no matter what you want to call it, as a car. Formula One car, really fast on the track. There's nothing that beats it. Take it off road, you're in trouble. I've got my big Humvee and I want to drive through very, very difficult terrain. It's going to be great. Put me on the track with that Formula One car, I'm never going to make it through the finish line before everybody else passes me by 50 times. So it's again specialized for a specific environment. They're all cars. They have 4 wheels and engine, steering wheel, and so on, but they are specifically made for certain things that they will excel at, or there will be overlap. You take an SUV that was made by Lamborghini, and it's going to be pretty good off-road, it's still gonna beat my stupid Hyundai when we're driving on the highway, and it's gonna pass me by like crazy. So the what I forget who it said is that there's no solutions, there's only compromises. So you make choices and you're like, okay, I'm gonna get really good at this and that and so on. And when what you gain somewhere, you lose elsewhere.
You know, I would say you're exactly right, but I would say the car analogy can be made for techniques. So, like, I'm not going to throw a head kick in clinch range.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not going to throw an elbow 3 feet away from me, right? So, I don't really think of that in stylistic terms. I think of it in weapon terms because my a style is, I didn't even know. Like, I don't know, like I have this personal aversion to styles now because I studied so many styles which of people who were extraordinary. Like, oh, let me close mine. Right? Give an example. Japan has some in terms of individual sports, whether it's judo, wrestling too. People don't realize that Japanese have amazing freestyle wrestlers. And there was one Japanese wrestler who was like undefeated for like 12 years, you know, like she's great. She lost, but she was really amazing for a long time. And the only reason she lost, she's down, you know. Kyokushin karate, obviously, Japanese are amazing. Muay Thai, there are a lot of examples of really, really good Japanese Muay Thai fighters. Boxing, in the lower weight classes,
Yep.
The Japanese have some great boxers. Now, none of these guys cooperate with each other, which is why in mixed martial arts, right now, Japan is really not anything great. So they have all this potential, but nobody talks to each other. So they sit in their little houses styles and they don't learn. They just stay in their little hyper specialized worlds, like you said. And they're very comfortable there, like the warm blanket, and they never really grow. Like most Kyokushin guys would just don't want to ever talk about grappling. Most judo guys don't ever want to talk about punching or kicking, right? You know, boxers never want to actually learn how to defend a low kick or, you know, like they're in their world and they're very, very, very comfortable there. And they're very happy and they're very, very one-dimensional. And they live their whole lives there in this little, like small, you know, king of your little small castle. You know, the big fish in the little pond.
Yeah.
And so when you add style, you create these environments of expectations, lineage, and this, that. And to me, it's just a prison. So I had a very open-minded karate instructor when I was a kid. And when I was 10 years old, he said, René, if you really want to learn to fight, you have to look outside your house. You should study boxing. And you know what? Back then, there was not a lot of grappling. But he's like, you know what? And judo is a really great martial art. This is what my instructor said. He was a vision, 1979, 1980. He's like, René, you gotta learn boxing. Did I listen to him? Absolutely not. Because I was like, karate number one. You know, I was so caught in my identity of being a karate guy that I didn't even listen to my instructor because it was important for me to be loyal to the style. Even though my instructor was like, dude, life is evolution, life is growth. And he was very active in the PKA. He trained a number of fighters to compete and do very well in PKA. And he himself had knockdown karate matches with Chuck Norris and things like that. And many, many different things. He's a very open-minded guy, right? And he welcomed boxers into our academy and Muay Thai fighters. And he's very open-minded. But the majority of my students, my peer group, and the ones before and after, and myself at that time, until I had a very eye-opening experience, became close. Nobody really listened to me. They became close-minded. We're like, 1, 2, 3. And man, he never even did that. So we got subsumed by the larger karate style because that was our identity. And it was so important to us and to me as a kid. But of course, I was 10 years old, so I didn't know. But as I got older, I'm like, this is a fucking cult bullshit, right? And it wasn't even created by my instructor. My instructor was like, guys, all martial arts are good. Learn from this. But nobody fucking listened, right? No, the inertia of the style, the inertia of, you know, especially like I said with the Gracies, when they have an emotional connection, a familiar connection, is so strong that you wind up imprisoning yourself and not looking. And I'll give you an example of the contrary, which is amazing, is you. Like, you're a style guy, but one of the reasons I respect you is because you're always looking at other things. And you said some very nice things about my game. It was incredibly appreciated. But most people from the Kung Fu world, because I gave a demonstration in front of a Kung Fu people who also did Sanda, not just old Kung Fu. They're like, whatever, this was bullshit. You know, like super close-minded, right? Not to say that all Kung Fu guys are like, that's not what I'm saying at all. I think also Sanda guys tend to be generally more open-minded, but like everybody gets stuck in their style, and they also, it's too much of a leap to like go and be a white belt again, right?
Yeah.
You know, like it's like I have this, you know, this big sash and this big belt around my waist, and I have social collateral, you know, so that I've gained from this years of this thing. Why am I going to go over there and be like a, you know, like some newbie? But Dan and Asante, this guy does it all the time. He goes to another style, says, "I'm putting a white belt. Let's go."
Yeah.
Like, so styles are mental traps that I am really trying to get away from. And Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has turned into this like garbage now that is so sport specific and style based and so very arrogant in what they say. But what they can do is nothing compared to what they did before, when Jiu-Jitsu was looking at a lot of other things. So guess what? Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys got their takedown game from Western wrestling. They got a lot of their hand control and Kimura game from Kimura, or even from catch wrestling. Like, they were hybridizing back then. They weren't just doing what they learned from Japan. They were evolving and moving it. Well, yes, their striking was not amazing, but compared to like judo guys, they were way ahead of it in striking. You know, now they're not, you know, you're like a really amazing striker, but they were on the right track, you know, of evolving and growing. And that completely stopped in 1996 with the advent of modern sport jiu-jitsu, which said, we're going to stay in our loop. We're not going to go anywhere. We're just going to talk about this. And I hate that, which is why I don't consider myself a jiu-jitsu guy anymore, ever. I don't know if I ever did, because I've studied 18 different martial arts. I'm a study of human geometry, a student, you know, and I learned from it.
I get that. I mean, from your experience, I get that point of view perfectly. It makes perfect sense. My experience is different. And for instance, like talking about Chinese style, there's like Pa Chi Chuan, which is a lot of elbows, headbutting, knees to the groin, and coming really close. But when you're, not all of them do it, but it's kind of built into the system. Is like, okay, this is a specific system, a bunch of techniques, principles, and so on. Once you get to a certain point of getting good at that, you're supposed to go study Pigua, which is long range stuff, and very, very different. And they're supposed to complement each other. And that is built into the system. It's like, as far as I know, most teachers emphasize that. It's like, okay, you're good enough doing this now, keep training. However, now go do that stuff. And I've seen that many times in Chinese martial arts, where they're like, okay, I've taken you as far as I can go. I want you to go train with that guy, because he's going to make you better, and it's going to be different style than I do. So you become modular in a way. You're adding modules to what you can do, but each individual module is a thing in and of itself. But and correct me if I'm wrong, I think what I hear you say is more along the lines of just people being human beings, being dicks, being assholes. And for me, that is separate from the issue of styles.
Is it though?
I think so. For me, it is.
I think in a perfect world, I think what happened was you had some amazing experienced teachers.
I've had some crappy ones as well.
Yeah, of course. Well, yeah. But most of the instructors that I met through the martial arts, people that I trained under or met through the martial arts, especially the ones I meet, are incredibly parochial and scared about, first of all, they're scared about losing students because it's right. So if I tell you to go over there, suddenly you're not paying me tuition. So the commercialization, modern monetization of training has changed a lot of things, right? But the other thing is sometimes it's not even money. It's like, you know, you're disloyal. So, you know, nobody when I was a kid that ever was talking about cross training in America, ever. It was anathema. You could not do that. That was, except my instructor was telling me to go do boxing. He's like, go down to the the PAL. Please, go box, learn to box. And I'm like, no, I'm gonna do my katas, right? You know, my instructor was literally telling me that, and nobody ever listened.
Yeah.
You know, because it's not even assholes. We're just more comfortable in our little ponds, you know?
Yeah.
That being said, I really love to hear that stories of people saying, go learn this and go learn that. That's a wonderful thing. And I wish the martial art world had more of it. But it can also be, like I said, my instructor told me to do that. And I didn't listen because it's just weird, you know, like human beings are weird. You know, you don't want to step out of your comfort zone. Right.
And
you know,
I don't want to give you the impression that it's always like that in Chinese martial arts, but for sure, I mean, the same parochial mindset I've seen plenty of times, plenty of teachers. So it's by far not. I mean, I'm sure there's a shitload of people who did Chinese martial arts had the exact same experiences that you had. I've seen some of it with teachers that I've known. They're like, yeah, you know, you're not supposed to go train in another school because then you're abandoning the art or whatever they wanted to call it, and all that kind of stuff. And I was fortunate in that I only had a little bit of that, but also that when I came to a different art, it was going to be very difficult for them to say, like, you can't train anywhere else. Well, then I'm going to say, like, well, I've been doing that for just the last 10 years. So what are you saying? Like, I can only join your club if I abandon everything else? That's a cult to me. I'm not going into
I
a cult.
actually say that to my students in the beginning because I say, like, you don't have the bandwidth to go somewhere else. But when you get to a high level, of course you can, and you could train anywhere you want. But at the beginning students who don't have any martial art training, it's like, dude, you don't have the bandwidth unless you pay attention to this now. So I do say that, but I say it's not a political thing. It's like, you don't know anything. You need to listen to what I say for at least 5 years before you can, like, digest other stuff. Now, at a certain level of expertise, then you should go off and experiment in places. Like I'm telling my guys right now, my fighters, I'm like, you should go to this gym and spar there. You should go there. You should train with this guy. But they're mature, intermediate to advanced level guys.
Oh yeah, right? I think it was Rick Young, I think, said that I would give something along the lines of, I'll give any martial art or system like 3 years, and I think that's a good idea, a good way of viewing it, so that you have to give yourself enough time to get far enough so you actually know what you're talking about. Like for me in the Tai Chi that I do, it's supposed to work on the first day. It's going to be really crappy. You're not going to be very good at it, but you will be able to get your head out of the way of that incoming punch and hit the guy back. And then we're going to work for a very long time to make that as efficient as we possibly can, and add a bunch of other stuff on top of that. But the basis is always going to be there. From my first class with my teacher, first thing that happened, they show me some basics. This is how we move, blah, blah, blah. It's going to take you a long time to get good at this, but this is what it is. And then, okay, so punch comes at your face, get your head out of the way, hit him back. Simple as it is. And only then we add layer upon layer upon layer of complexity that you can only do if you can do the bottom layers. You don't skip ahead to the end, which is like what a lot of people have. They see the teacher do something, it's like, oh my God, this is amazing. They never see the path he had to take to get there. And then they're like, no, you can't do this just yet. Like you said, you don't have the bandwidth. You also don't have the experience and the training to do something. And it's not about advanced techniques. It's just being able to do the basics so well that they look like an advanced technique.
Now it's funny. Get your head out of the way and hit it. To me, that just sounds like boxing or Muay Thai or whatever. Like it's again human principles, and it's smart, right?
Yeah. So, but and I'm sorry to interrupt you. So I'm going to say the same thing. So when we talk about systems, this is for me where it's at. So yes, in boxing you slip and then you give your own jab or whatever. Yes. And then what I'm supposed to do, if I'm good enough in my Tai Chi, is yes, I'm going to slip your punch. And as I make contact, I'm supposed to break your balance. I'm supposed to break your balance with the way that I punch, push, kick, strike, whatever I'm doing to you, so that we get to our next step, which is with what we want, is that you end up on the floor and I don't. So that is a very specific goal, methodology, and end result that I'm always working towards. Whatever I do, I'm always working towards that. Get the guy on the ground without following him there. which is radically different from boxing, which is that I'm going to slip that punch so I can punch him back. Whether it's to the head or to the body, I will punch him until the guy's knocked out, knocked down, whatever it is. Never crossing his mind that I have to break his balance, that I have to get him on the ground and avoid ending up in a situation where I end up on the ground with him. Very different.
Yes.
And one more thing. A friend of mine has he's doing a system. Every single thing they do is going to end up towards one specific technique. That everything they do, and it's too long to get into to give all the details, but there's like a pathway and a system, like a systemized way of approaching things, strategy, tactics, mindset, biomechanical things as well. It's like everything leads to this one outcome. Do you get there? Not necessarily, but you're going towards that. Just like you said in BJJ, you said you try to get the back. Everything leads to that. So, and that is how I see styles and systems, is that they've got these specific things, goals, and so on, and they get to a certain point, a certain way. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think that's really true, but it's really defined by rules. So modern boxing, is Queensberry rules, basically revised. But, before they had Brown's rules where you could throw the guy. Yeah. And if you couldn't get up, which is the origin of 10 count, if you couldn't get up from the throw, meaning you really threw him, you would win, right? Yep. So it's the nature of, they removed it because of the special sport of competition. And the interesting thing, the reason why Marquis de Queensberry took away all the grappling is because the aristocracy, who liked the fisticuffs, would lose to the farm boys who naturally good at wrestling because they're wrestling calves and animals all day.
That's strong.
Yeah. So they're like, we don't like the aristocrats losing to the peasant farm boys. So what do? We get rid of the grappling, and we put on gloves that make you not able to grapple, and we limit clinch and things like that. So these are man-made constructions, right? Based on rules. However, I think you're right. At some level, we said geography determines warfare. Environment determines, in a freestyle no rules environment is going to determine where you in an elevator or an open space. We're going to determine what's the most effective move. Like a lot of supposedly Wing Chun type martial arts developed in Chinese alleyways or boats or things like that. Nobody knows if it's true. Whatever. I'm not a historical, but obviously fighting in an alley is going to make your punches much more in a certain direction than it is if you're out and you can move and bob and weave and change angles. And then fighting in an open plane where you can kick, like environment dictates things. So I think styles, originally, for sure, they came out of specific environment impetus, but now today, mostly they're just rule impetuses or traditional orientations for the sake of tradition. But I think you can learn, like, hey, in this style, I look a lot at Wing Chun, and I don't think modern Wing Chun is really as effective as it could be, but it has some interesting things to teach us about close quarter engagements where you absolutely cannot move anywhere, but you need to control him and are maybe possibly, like really blocked off. So it's an interesting thing to look at. Again, I adjust the environment and I look at the human challenge.
Yeah. And I would add to that context. Friend of mine, he shared me that I think it was a drawing. It's not a painting. I think it was a really old drawing, and you see this noble guy putting a knife to a peasant's throat, and he talked about that actually that this is a technique, and the way you do that the technique is you don't want to kill the peasant if you're a nobleman, but you do want him to listen. So you want him to get scared for his life. So you will do the technique a certain way so that you are drawing blood with the knife. He thinks you're going to cut his throat. He's going to be scared as shit. But you know that you can't kill him with the way that you hold the skin and you do this and that. But that he doesn't know that. So the context is extremely specific, but it is a technique you need to learn. Because if you fuck it up, you actually do kill him. So you don't want to kill him. Now that is a context that is completely alien to any
But
modern
it's-
self-defense.
It's kind of not, because New York has this interesting rule right now for self-defense encounters where once you're in a control position and out of danger, you're legally not allowed to go further. So if you've controlled the guy and he can't hurt you, you're not allowed to exceed that level of force. So a lot of like times, like if you have him on his back and you choke him out, you could be possibly facing felony assault. You need to be able to intimidate him, control him, or find a way to hold him down until the police come, or scare him enough that you're not legally violent. Now, that being said, I've been in certain situations where I think I was legally in the clear, even though I did do things that were led to the injured this person who attacked me. But being said, you know, particularly things are recorded now. So legal context is what we're dealing rather than social class context. But legal context goes back to the samurai. Like we talked about the Kiristego men, which is the samurai walking out and just killing the peasant. That is actually a myth. Did that exist? It did, but you had to absolutely justify why you killed the peasant, because your peasant is the foundation of your money. So if you couldn't go to your lord and say, hey, this is why I did this, and justify it, you'd be in big trouble. You couldn't just walk around and kill someone just for it because they established rules, because the peasant was a money generator. That's an asset. So the same thing. It's like, in context is king. Context is everything.
And that brings us all the way back to the beginning of our talk. Is when we talked about just the way that modern the way men and women react now comes back from a lot of etiquette and social constructs that are ancient. But back in those days, it might have made more sense, because, like you said, if you killed a farmer, I think in the Middle Ages it was something along the lines of, for every one person who would not have to work, like royalty didn't have to work, there had to be like 10 or 12 people who had to do manual labor, farming and agriculture and all that kind of stuff, so they would have food on the table. Nowadays, with what we have technology-wise and modern farming methods and all the technology we have, that's no longer the case. It's quite the opposite. It's only a fraction of people are actually making sure we have food, where most of the people, they don't have to do anything about it. Just it magically appears in the supermarket or in the deli, like ta-da, magic happens and we have food. So you have to have a society in which that functions, that those 12 people actually do the work. There needs to be a reason. Well, your lord is actually he's put in that position by divine intervention. He rules by with the support of whatever god you believe in, and it's his divine right and this and that. And back then that might have made sense, but nowadays not so much. We have a king over here. So I live in a country that is a royal democracy. So we're a democracy. We've got a government. We also have a king. He doesn't really have much to say anymore, but he's still here. He's got shitloads of land. He's very, very rich, and he's still here, and we have to deal with that. Where do kings come from? I'm going to so overgeneralize. All the historians are going to get fucking upset with me. But with the fall of the Roman Empire, a lot of local tribes basically got back to get more power, and a lot of local military men ended up becoming warlords, who basically eventually caught enough territory to make it some sort of fiefdom, and that eventually evolved into our royalty, which is like hundreds and hundreds of years ago, but we're still stuck with that stuff. Now, there are some positives to that as well. There is something to say about sorry?
Kind of like styles.
Yes. There is something to say about a society that has a structure, with people saying like, this is the stuff that needs to be done, and then we can get to a whole discussion about all the things that people think about the medieval times in Europe that is just flat out wrong. Like, yes, the average peasant and citizen had a really, really hard life, but it's not that. Go ahead.
Can you give me a second, buddy? I'm sorry.
A few moments later.
Right, you good?
Sometimes, it's like,
Oh, I know, dude. I totally know. And I'm gonna put, I'm gonna Edit. I don't often do edits in the podcast because it's I like it to flow more. But there's going to be several instances in which I'm going to do the classic, like a few moments later when we have to do a cut in the podcast. So everybody listening,
I'm so sorry.
no, it's okay.
I just,
Renee's being
yeah.
harassed by crazy people.
And you know what? You know it's funny because it's from the Soviet Union. I guarantee we get these guys all the time. They're like, I want to fight pro and make money. And I'm looking at him like, I can coach you. You already know everything. So, why do I teach? I teach, to really try to test out my theories on fighting. But if I have students who are not interested in learning my theories, then which I could just tell right away. It's like, why are you here? You don't want to learn. You just want to, get a paycheck.
Not that long ago, I had a guy who, a young guy, very, very young guy, who had been doing kickboxing and came to my MMA class. And I tried to explain to him, look, I love kickboxing, used to do it myself. Thing you have to understand is that many different rules, and that is why we do the techniques a little bit different over here. For instance, we can do takedowns. You're not allowed to do takedowns in kickboxing. If you don't want to go to the ground, you have to be able to defend yourself against a takedown, which means your stance is going to change, which means you being in a very high, narrow stance, bouncing on the balls of your feet is not going to work.
Yes.
Then he spent the next hour and a half ignoring everything I said and doing the techniques in his kickboxing way. And I'm like,
there's no point in teaching these people. Yeah, it's like it's just a freaking headache. Hey, I'm gonna actually have to start teaching soon.
Yeah.
But I know you have the Patreon questions. Do you want to meet again another time and add a second interview?
I
have no problem.
How much time do you have left?
I really have to. The people are going to start coming in a lot. So
no, we're going to do it another time. Let's schedule another time where we just do the Patreon. That's going to be easier because I just looked at what time it is, dude. I totally took up your entire afternoon. I'm so sorry.
Not at all. My pleasure. It's an honor, absolute honor talking with you. It's wonderful. This conversation was the height of my day, and it's fantastic just to talk with you because you're a great dude. And
I had a blast. You're a great guy, René. Quickly, where can people reach you? I'm going to add that to the show notes.
RadicalMMANYC.com.
All right. Okay. So, folks, by the time you listen to this, we will have done the bonus episode on Patreon, so you can check it out there. I'm sure René and I will gonna go. That is no holds bar. That's Vale Tudo talking. It's like we've restrained ourselves a little bit now, and then it's going to be balls to the wall, all out, pedal to the metal, no holding back, and hope you guys join us there. René, thanks again.
No worries. Thanks, buddy. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.